What's up, guys? Hey, how's it going? Is everybody doing good? Hi. Good to see ya. Hey, what's going on? Hello, everybody. It's good to see you. I'm good. I'm good. I got a quick little nap in, and yeah, that's that. Oh, I need to check something real quick. Hold on. Going to hide the model real quick. Something's going on. Okay, there we go. Now that I've gotten that squared away. All right, I'm back. And yes, Peach, this is a temporary model. I don't know if you've ever seen it. Oh, let me fix this real quick. Hello, model, can you please? There we go. All right, that's a little better. Yeah, so this is a temp model. I'm currently getting a model made. But yeah, this is a model I put together myself. It literally, I threw it together. But yeah, hi guys. It's so good to see everybody. Yes, so I've got some stories lined up. I picked some really long ones. Yeah. Let's see. All right, so I think this is the first one. Okay, yeah. So I picked some long ones today to kind of like balance out everything that's going on. Got a smattering. We're gonna do some stories that I'm gonna read live, and then I have some videos that we're gonna play from the channel for those of you who are new to the channel and haven't gotten a chance to listen to some of my older stuff from back in the day. So yeah, we're just going to be kind of messing around, doing stuff like that with it. I think it'll be fun. Hey, Mark. Yeah, I say I'm trying to do stuff a little bit earlier in the afternoon versus like when it's actually dark for me, because I know a lot of my big supportive members and people who've been following the channel for a long time, they live overseas. So I kind of want to accommodate them by streaming a little earlier in the day. But yeah, no, I'm doing good. I'm doing good. I hope you're doing well too. And yeah, Pitt, I hope you're doing really, really good. I know you've been busy working on commissions and stuff, so I hope that continues to be prosperous for you guys. Yeah, so anyway, we won't linger on this too long. I just want to go on ahead and jump straight into this. It's going to be a long stream today. I say long stream. It's going to be a series of long stories today. And I found a trilogy story that I'll probably end the night with. Each story in the trilogy is about 25 to 30 minutes long, so that'll be exciting. I have water. I hope everyone has water. I hope you have snacks. I hope you're hydrated and good to go. I'm trying to see what we can start with. Happy St. Patty's Day. Yeah, happy St. Patrick's Day, guys. This is going to be fun. I don't really have any St. Patty's Day stories, unfortunately, so we're just going to have to go from there. But yes, we will get to that. Just trying to sort everything else out first, guys. Alright, first story we're going to read. Well, hold on, let me set the tone here real quick. We got a nice quiet thing going on here. We don't want to start off like that, do we? Nah, I don't think we do. Okay then. Let's see. Gonna start off things the correct way. Okay. Let's get started, everybody. The first story is called Blue Dollars by Matt Demersky. I will give you the link to the story. Feel free to follow along with me as I read aloud. I don't have a gambling problem. That's the first thing I want known. It's also what they all say, right? No, I'm not addicted to gambling, but I have a codependency issue with someone who is. I'm not the coolest guy on the block, and I'm not particularly good at anything. Ted is, though, and we've been best friends since we were 4. He's the one who always pushes forward blindly into adventures, and I guess I'm the one who always gets him back out when things go sideways. There's always been an element of luck to our continued physical and financial survival, but never more than now. We'd flown out to Napa Valley for a friend's wedding and already ditched the reception party at around 11. I could hardly afford to do anything. I'd only been able to come because Ted had bought me a ticket. Because I was only there on his generosity, I followed him to the quiet and rather empty bars that sparsely dotted the area. It was beautiful country, filled with vineyards and history, but it was not a party town. This frustrated Ted, of course, who began plying locals with drinks in order to interrogate them about local hotspots. "Somebody has to be having fun in this town," he would say with a grin. One bitter old man finally spoke up at the third empty bar we invaded. "There's a casino, if you really need it that bad." We looked at our phones, but Google Maps showed nothing. "It won't be on any map," the old man said, scowling at us. "Just go south from here and you'll find it." Behind our informant, I saw an unhappy look on the bartender's face. That should have tipped me off, but Ted was already thanking the old man and heading for the door. I followed quickly, ignoring the uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. Driving through the rolling hills at night was a claustrophobic and confusing experience. Our phone signal dropped and we found ourselves driving purely by instinct. West, south, east? It was impossible to know for sure. We stuck to the sole road until it turned to dirt underneath the wheels. That's when I almost called the whole thing. But Ted pulled up outside a graveyard and pointed. "Look! Cars!" And he was right. 24 cars were parked on the grass next to an unassuming old church that had all its windows boarded up. He'd only caught the sight across the graveyard and through the trees because he'd been looking so intently. Triumphant, he said, "That's a hidden party if I've ever seen one," and carefully drove the car between the headstones to reach the improvised parking area. I climbed out with trepidation. Even up close, the century-old church looked dilapidated, dark, and abandoned. Come on, this is too much. Ted wasn't having it. He ran right up and pushed open the front door, and bright light and the sounds of electronic games burst forth. In a moment, he was gone, and I was left to step across the high grass alone. The fact that there was actually a hidden casino here lifted my spirits a little. Maybe it was all just a gimmick to encourage people to drink and gamble more. Funny, it still sounded quiet and looked dark until the moment I cracked the door open. The light and noise swallowed me, and I blinked repeatedly until my eyes and ears adjusted. I was almost disappointed to find that the expansive place within was exactly the same as any of the casinos Ted had made us visit in Las Vegas last year. Vaguely, old-timey, red and gold carpets ran lush under warm lighting, and drunk businessmen and their accompanying younger dates played as scattered locations throughout. An old lady glared at me, defending her slot machine, and pulled the lever only after I moved past. Finally relaxing, I shrugged. Whatever. We weren't going to be robbed or stabbed here. This was still Napa Valley after all. In fact, they were rather accommodating. A wonderfully attractive waitress came by, said hello to me, and offered me a free drink on the house. I took it with a bashful surprise. Ted was already moving about the place to scout the best games and tables. I caught up to him, and drink in hand, and he settled near a roulette table. "Let's just watch for a bit," he said quietly. "Make sure everything's on the level. Hidden in a church like this, I doubt they stick to gaming commission codes." That made sense. We watched and listened for a bit, enjoying the taste of free drinks and the sight of pretty girls, as middle-aged businessmen won and lost with varying degrees of frequency. One pepper-haired Asian suit went on a lucky streak, getting the crowd all riled up, himself included, while onlookers shrieked with excitement. He bet it all. And he lost. "Seems legit," Ted told me. "I'm going to head over to the blackjack table for a minute." And he moved off to begin playing. That was everything I had, the Asian businessman said, dismayed. The two girls that had been clinging to his arms disengaged and began to look disinterested. Hurriedly, he made a motion to a casino manager, and the well-dressed but subtly subservient facilitator brought him a small suitcase. It clicked open with a rush of air, and I watched as the unlucky gambler pulled out bundled stacks of blue dollar bills. That was odd. They were American dollars, same faces, designs, and everything, just dark blue instead of green. Was this fake money? Some sort of in-house system? Come to think of it, I saw no chips, just money. If these were the replacement for chips, why all the care to make them so similar to real dollars? The gambler in question did not have the same qualms. He gladly placed the stacks on the table. The crowd grew energized again, and the girls began showing him attention once more. Feeling a little strange, I moved off seeking Ted. I found him at the blackjack table as he won a hand. Grinning, he pumped a fist. I like this place. Come on, play. I don't have any money for this, I told him, sheepish. Here's some. He handed me a $100 bill. I took it and sat, but secretly stashed the 100 and pulled the last of my own cash reserves from my wallet. As I always did, I would return his money back to him when he wasn't looking. He never made me feel bad about it, and he had a high-paying job besides, but I just couldn't stomach leeching off of someone else like that. We played a few hands while still enjoying free drinks. I drank slower to remain soberish, but Ted guzzled away, having the time of his life. He lost quite a few hands, but played well, and actually started accumulating more money than he'd come in with. I, in contrast, lost all of my meager cash rather quickly. Upon the loss of my last dollar, a suited man with slicked back hair and a politician's grin approached and leaned down between us, an arm on the back edge of each of our chairs. He spoke with a thick Middle Eastern accent, although his skin was pale enough that it was uncertain what region he was from. "Gentlemen, welcome. I don't think I've seen you grace our establishment before. I am Malcolm." "Nice to meet you," Ted said. "This place is great. Love the free drinks." "Yes," Malcolm said with a widening grin. "A small expense in the face of a casino's profit. I am not a greedy man." "So, you're the owner?" I asked, not wanting to be left out. "Yes, but think of me as your friend." He finally moved back and stood upright. His gaze shifted to me. "I see you are out of money. Would you like to keep playing?" He motioned a manager over, and a briefcase was opened before me, complete with the stacks of blue dollar bills I'd seen before. I glanced over awkwardly. Ted was suspicious, but open to the idea. "What are these?" "They represent debt," Malcolm said graciously. "Interesting." Ted looked to me. "You should do it, Ryan." But that was not my name. "I think I'm all right, Jason," I replied. What did he have in mind? I imagine he was planning to use these blue dollars if needed and then slip out. They couldn't make us pay back a debt if they had no idea who we were. Accepting my refusal, Malcolm ordered the suitcase closed and withdrew. "Good luck, gentlemen." I was left with a chill and a shiver. From then on, I could only sit and watch as Ted gambled, talked up girls, and had a good time. The free drinks were no longer offered to me, and indeed, none of the patrons or employees would so much as look at me. I should have noticed, but again, my life was often lonely. I simply accepted it. We moved from game to game, eventually ending up back at roulette, and Ted soon found himself in a situation we had witnessed earlier. Energized crowd, streak of lucky wins, and a potential for a huge payoff. Despite my whispered warnings, he bet everything he had. The ball bounced, the numbers were called, and I sighed. He'd lost. Malcolm returned with a grin, I imagined to be rather hungry, and the suitcase was offered to Ted. Someone in the crowd squeezed my forearm in warning, but by the time I looked, it was impossible to tell who had done it. "Don't. Let's go home." "Come on, Ryan," he shouted back. I could tell he still intended to rip off the establishment. "Let's have some fun." Reaching down, he eagerly pulled out 2 armfuls of blue dollar stacks, most of which he pawned off on me. I held them as he bet blue money on another roll. It might have been my imagination, but the stacks felt subtly warm. He won, thankfully. But that quickly led to more bets, and I watched with a sinking feeling as my load of blue dollars shrank. The eyes of the crowd were upon us very intently now, and Malcolm seemed to be staring solely at Ted, grinning only when Ted looked his way. "We should go," I said again, but Ted ignored me. There were 100 opportunities to leave, but Ted took none of them. At long last, his final blue dollar went to the house. At that point, he whispered his intent to me, and I took off running after him on a heartbeat later. I made it to the door and burst into the cool night air, but Ted remained just within. "What are you doing?" I shouted to him. "Get out here!" He seemed horrified. He stared down at his feet as they toed the red and gold carpet's edge. I can't leave." Malcolm approached calmly behind Ted, flanked by 2 suited managers. Sensing something was wrong, I leaped forward and kept the church door from closing, but I made sure to remain just outside. "Malcolm, what the hell is this?" The grinning man gave a small laugh. "I told you that my money was a form of debt. People like your friend here never listen. They think that they can cheat the house. Perhaps that would be possible if the house, in this case, were not a demon. But it is. I am. And he is now indebted." I stared up at him, trembling, but it seemed that I was not in direct danger. The next question was obvious. What does he owe? "The same thing that is always owed," Malcolm told me, his grin widening along his cheeks in a starkly inhumane manner. Each blue dollar represented a portion of his soul. If even one remained, there was a chance he might win it all back and more. Thus, I would not technically own him. With not even one blue dollar left, he has no chance of escape. He is mine. Looking past him, I saw the patrons and the employees watching us. I understood. They were all his. The Asian businessman I had seen gambling had been one of us, free, but no longer. I looked back to Malcolm, thinking about his explanation of chance. "So you operate by rules then?" "Of course. I am a demon, rule-bound by nature. This type of thing must be enacted fairly." Ted still struggled with the invisible threshold, his eyes on me, his expression desperate. "How do I get him out?" I asked, my pulse racing. If the roles had been reversed, I was sure Ted would have had a plan, but I had no idea what to do. Malcolm laughed softly for a full 5 seconds before answering. "There is nothing you can do except leave. To buy back even a single blue dollar, he must have money. He has no money, therefore he cannot buy back the single blue bill required. Believe me when I tell you that this is not my establishment's, how do you Americans say, first rodeo?" Ted began screaming, but a gesture from Malcolm silenced him. Ted continued moving and opening his mouth, certainly, but no noise came out. Heart thudding in my chest hard enough that I feared I might pass out, I reached in my back pocket and slipped out the $100 bill. "How many of his blue dollars will this get me?" "It must be his money, not yours," Malcolm replied, his expression uncertain for the first time since I'd seen him. "It is his," I shouted. "He gave it to me to hold." A manager whispered in Malcolm's ear, and a frustrated sigh followed. "At current exchange rates, that 100 will purchase 21 of his blue bills." The other manager opened the suitcase, showing 21 loose bills, and I scooped them up before dropping the 100 in their place. Without warning, Ted's screams became audible again, and he fell forward into the graveyard with me. Grabbing him by instinct, I kept him from falling completely down, and Malcolm stood staring at us with anger. Now that his careful veneer was fading, I could see ghastly undertones in his skins and the pale outlines of numerous gnarled horns on his head and on the heads of the managers beside him. Ted accepted the 21 blue dollars from me and stood, slowly recovering his wits and breath. "Jesus, they had me," he gripped my shoulder. "You got me out. You got me out. You always do. Thank you. Thank you." I nodded and began backing away from that unhallowed place. There was no way we could have known. "Care to make another wager?" the demon at the church door asked. "Now that you know what we are, there are greater winnings available. How would you care for immortality? Perhaps the power of flight or precognition? We can gift you these things, assuming you win enough." Ted stopped following me and turned to look back at Malcolm's charred face. A terrible, sinking feeling overcame me. "Don't!" "Imagine how much we could win if we could see the future," Ted said, still frozen in place. "We'd be set for life." "He's lying!" I shouted. "I cannot lie," Malcolm replied with amusement. "You know this." I'll just bet 20, Ted called back. I'll still have the one, so I'll still be free. I kept screaming, but Ted staggered toward that open door and pushed within. Fully gruesome now, Malcolm gave me a maggot-filled smile, and the door shut of its own accord. Opening and closing the rotted wood a few times, I discovered nothing but a musty and abandoned church within. I could also now see that the cars parked outside were rusted and ancient, with models ranging from modern to classic. Those that had come here over the last 50 years had never left. Surely I wasn't the first to turn down the Blue Soul money. How had I never heard of the old man at the bar? His bitterness. He'd lost somebody here, to this place, to Malcolm. And Ted had been obviously doomed soul from the start. Telling him had simply sped up the inevitable. I began the long walk home. I was alone now, and that was no longer my biggest fear. I'd done my part. I'd pulled a lucky last-minute move and saved Ted from a demon uniquely suited to his flaws, but he'd chosen to go back anyway. There was nothing I could do but go on alone and wonder when my own particular brand of demon would fall across my path. On that day, I, too, would be lost. Thus was born Malcolm's demonic confidence, even with friends to offer one last chance at escape. We are all human. We are each our own doom. Jeez Louise, guys. Don't gamble, okay? Don't fall into gambling addiction, all right? It's very dangerous. Okay, let's see here. What did we do last time? Thank you. I'm trying to find one that we can listen to real quick. Well, I say real quick. It's not going to be a short video. You know what? Let's do Miss Marnie's Tea House. We'll kind of split that in the mix here since it's a 4-parter. Oh gosh, right. Cuphead was so good. And a really good freaking lesson for people to, pay attention to. All right, here we go.
You're going to hell. Child of Satan, you'll burn in agony just like the Jews and towelheads. God will cast thee down into Gehenna. Burn, witch!
That's how I used to begin my morning. Every morning. I live in the same little townhouse that my mother lived in, and her mother before her, and for as long as I can remember, we've lived next to Mrs. Thompson, who is perhaps the nastiest person I've ever met. Her voice has assaulted my ears since childhood. Either she was yelling at my mother or antagonizing me while I played outside. I don't know how she came to the conclusion that we're witches, but no matter how kind we were to her, her words were always the same. Die, burn in hell, Satan's spawn, witches, bitches. So, every morning, I'd walk to my car amid her screeching and try to tune it out as I prepared for the day. After all, it's no good coming into work at a tea house when you're stressed. Your foul mood will poison the tea. At least, that's what my mother always told me. Just like our home, the tea house has been in my family for generations. It is always owned and managed by a woman, and we never take employees. They just aren't needed. Besides, it's hard to teach a newcomer the finer points of tea making. Me? I've been studying tea since I was a child, as my mother passed down her secrets to me. It's a wonderful job, a wonderful life, and I quite enjoy it. All except for Mrs. Thompson, of course. Every morning at the tea house was the same. I began by rinsing out the cast iron teapot and teacups. You can't use soap on them, and you can't wash the outside. You can only rinse them, and over time they'll take on the flavor of the teas you brew in them, which is why I have a separate tea set for each kind of tea. Green, black, yellow, oolong, white, and herbal infusions. I'd set the metal teapots to brew hot water on the stove. You can't put cast iron on the stove either. While prepping the water, I'd select the teas I would feature that day. Of course, a customer can come in and request any kind of tea they like, but I always like to give my own recommendations. I would open the store at about 9 o'clock in the morning and I'd spend the day serving tea. I had quite a few regular customers that enjoyed the healing properties of tea. People with stomach problems who liked the jade mint oolong. People with anxiety who preferred the chamomile blossom. People who simply enjoyed the traditional taste and brewing process of matcha. Well, one morning, someone new came into the tea house. Someone I never expected to see. Jamie Thompson. Mrs. Thompson's grandson, who spent most of his time caring for the aging crony, was standing at the front of my tea house, watching me serve mango black tea for a few elderly tourists looking for something sweet and strong.
Miss Marnie, I see your tea house is doing well,
he began. I noticed the elderly woman staring at him in open appreciation. He was quite handsome, even I must admit, but I ignored him and went back to the tea preparation. Tea takes all of your attention, all of your heart. If you don't give everything you've got, it will fail you, because you've already failed yourself. Once the tea was prepared and the women were enjoying it iced, I stood up and approached the conspicuous newcomer. Mr. Thompson, I take it? What can I do for you today? Most of the time, I'd start by asking what a customer likes, what a customer needs, what ailments are troubling them. I like to help people. But I was wary of Jamie. Nothing good comes from a poison plant, after all.
Well, I'm actually here to get something for my grandmother. See, her mind is going. I read that tea is good for dementia, and I was wondering if you had any recommendations?
It's true. Studies have shown that certain kinds of tea are good at preserving brain mass, but as of yet, nothing in modern medicine is miraculous enough to reverse dementia. Still, nature works in funny ways. I went behind the front counter to examine my selection of green teas.
You know, my grandmother, she probably wouldn't drink this if she knew that you prepared it.
I grunted in assent, none too keen on continuing our conversation. Jamie didn't seem to notice my reticence, or perhaps he didn't care.
But, you know, I'm hoping that maybe this will help patch things up between you two. I think that she would really like you if she got to know you. I've always found you fascinating.
I selected some Gyokuro Imperial and turned to face him, appraising his expression. The light in his eyes told me that he was using his grandmother as a pretense to come see me. Oh. Ignoring his obvious interest, I prepared the tea leaves and rang up his purchase, explaining how they were best brewed and when to drink it for the best results. To his credit, he was very attentive, although he seemed more interested in my lips than the words coming out of them.
Well, thank you for this. I'll give it to my grandmother and, well, come back and tell you the results.
You needn't bother, I retorted, anxious to get him out of my store. But he smiled in return, not a bit perturbed by my attitude.
Oh, you can't get rid of me that easily, Miss Marnie.
With that, he turned and strode out of the store, the tourist still gawking at his tall, muscular frame. That was the start of all the trouble. Since that day, Jamie started coming in regularly, always asking for my recommendations, always claiming that my tea helped his grandmother heal. I sincerely doubted that, but I didn't bother correcting his ignorance. After all, it was just a facade. At the close of each purchase, he would ask me the exact same question.
So, do you have any plans for the night?
Most of the time, I declined to answer. I had to admit he was patient and persistent. He never missed a day. He was also sweet in his own way. He handed out compliments like candy, but only ever to me. Sometimes he brought in flowers, although I couldn't keep them in the store. The scent would taint the tea. He brought me sweets on occasion. It was really getting on my nerves. Finally, one day he didn't immediately ask me out. Instead, he presented me with an opportunity, one that was too good to pass up.
Honestly, Marnie, I'll do anything you want just to have one date. What do I have to do?
You can't afford a date with me, I assured, although the wheels in my head were already turning.
Money is not an object. Living next to my grandma all these years, you have to know that my family is loaded.
He flashed me his patented, arrogant grin that somehow managed to hold a certain magnetic charm.
Name it. I'll do it. I'll make you understand how serious I am.
He seemed serious, and I thought maybe, just maybe, he could be the one I'd been searching for. And if he was, oh, I'd never dared dream. I grabbed out a post-it note and began scribbling the details on it as I told him what I wanted more than anything in the world. There is a tea grown in the Fujian province of China called Da Hong Pao, or Big Red Robe. It grows so high on the mountains that only a few select tea masters are able to pick it. However, what many people don't know is that there are two strains of Da Hong Pao, the kind that is sold to the public, and a rarer kind that is used in medicine and religious rituals. I glanced into his eyes, but they remained impassive. I dared to finish. I want you to get it for me. He smirked as though he was amused by my reticence.
No problem. Is it expensive?
I paused to consider that question. The tea itself? No. If you tell them you need it, if you tell them I need it, they'll give it to you. Only you have to fly to China and get it yourself. They won't send it to you. You won't be able to find a trace of them outside of their own little province. They're cut off from the world, and that's what makes their tea so special. Jamie paused as if to consider this, making a very serious face and stroking his chin. Finally, he winked at me.
Consider it done.
My heart skipped a beat. All this time, searching for the right person, and he'd been right next to me, waiting for me to notice him. Life seemed to move at a glacial pace after that. Jamie bought the tickets and set the date for 6 months after I gave him my request. During that half year, he studied Mandarin with a passion that I'd never seen in anyone else before. He also managed to track down a Fujianese native and began studying the dialect. He took very careful instruction from me as to how he could find these master tea pickers. The day before he left, he came to see me, glowing with confidence as though he had already succeeded in his quest. I knew that the worst was yet to come for him, but he didn't seem concerned. Before he walked out of my store, he stood in front of me and requested, no, demanded a kiss for good luck. I was so excited and flustered that I leaned forward and pecked him on the lips without stopping to think. He laughed at the blush suffusing my skin and walked out, anticipating grand adventure. Weeks passed, several of them in fact, and yet not a word from Jamie. I tried to remind myself to be patient. After all, he had to arrive in China, hike to the mountains, and navigate his way to the secret property of the Master Pickers. Reaching them would take time, and that's not to mention gaining their trust. I could only hope that they would be a little more compliant when he mentioned my name. And then a few more weeks. I noticed that Mrs. Thompson was too preoccupied to harass me. She seemed shaken by Jamie's absence. Not that it surprised me. He was, after all, her primary caretaker, and though she could still manage on her own at this point, she liked the company. I was beginning to think that I would never hear back from Jamie when, one morning, I arrived at the tea house to find a man sitting in front of the shop. He was an elderly Chinese man wearing traditional garb. In his arm, he held a black lacquered chest. My heart stopped in my chest. When he saw me approach, he knelt in front of me and kowtowed 3 times. I inclined my head as a gesture of appreciation. Then I opened the tea house and let him inside. We didn't exchange any words, although I am fluent in both Mandarin and Fujianese. Instead, I brewed him a cup of golden monkey black tea, which he drank for ritual's sake. Once he finished his tea, he walked out the door and out of my life. But he left behind the chest. My hands shook as I lifted it, feeling its severe heft, and carried it to the back room. Locking the door and closing the blinds, I opened the chest. The first thing I saw were the bones. Each and every bone in Jamie's body sat in the chest, neatly packed into a solid mass. I took them out one at a time, spreading them over my work table, admiring their pristine white color. I had never seen something so beautiful. Beneath the bones, separated by a wooden slot, was the tea. The small, dark green leaves with distinct golden flecks. That was how I knew they'd given me the right product. The flashes of gold were the ticket. Yes, Jamie was the one that I'd been waiting for. The one I needed. The bargaining chip that got me my most precious treasure. He was a perfect sacrifice. Mrs. Thompson changed after Jamie was officially declared missing. It was assumed that he had died hiking in China. An inexperienced hiker can easily go missing without the proper guide. And just like that, she found herself alone in the world. Her other children and grandchildren would have nothing to do with her. She stopped screaming at me in the mornings. She stopped coming outside at all. But I couldn't just leave her alone like that. One morning, I brought a special tea brew over just for her. When I knocked on the door, I half expected her to cuss me out, shouting obscenities and misquoted Bible verses. Instead, she led me into her kitchen, and I brewed her tea. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. After a few minutes, she spoke on her own about how Jamie had been so taken with me, sung my praises until she herself had begun to come around, about how much she had always loved him, how her whole life had revolved around him ever since he had been born. She began crying at one point. In fact, she kept crying until I set her tea in front of her. Almost absent-mindedly, she sipped the brew and gave me a surprised look. This is good. I smiled at her. It is, isn't it? It only took a few days to get Mrs. Thompson to agree that I should be her new primary caretaker. Of course, she didn't need much care anymore, not after she began drinking my tea. After a few weeks, her forgetfulness, the signs of her dementia, they began to fade. She was as sharp as she'd always been. Of course, that was intentional. I do, after all, want her to live a nice, long life full of memories of Jamie and the agony of never knowing what happened to him. It's amazing what a little tea and bone marrow can do to a person. As for me, well, I got what I wanted. I got the rare formula I need to give my tea healing powers. I got the sacrifice for those brews that require something darker. And without Mrs. Thompson's ranting and screaming, my mornings became much more peaceful. Which, honey, that doesn't even begin to cover what I'm capable of. I love that story. I can't wait to get to the second part for you guys. But first, I'm going to read again. All right, next up is The Unfamiliar. And this is written by Alex Sorrow. It's pretty lengthy. It's like it says 16 minutes. It's probably going to take me about 20. So yes, feel free to read with me as I read aloud. The darkness is insurmountable here. The air reeks of salt water, decaying fish, and other human stenches that I cannot even begin to imagine, even if I felt the desire to. An unearthly black fog has settled over the city, as it does every night, and I yearn for a daylight that feels as though it may never come. The night in Malavera is oppressive, almost as though it were not night at all, but rather the natural state of the world around the city. Of course, there is hardly a problem with the town itself. The problem is what inhabits the town. Beneath the cover of darkness that invades the streets every night, I can hear the sounds of shuffling, weary feet drunkenly stumbling towards some unknowable destination, if one actually exists. From outside, I can hear the sharp words of ghouls wandering around, starting fights and wreaking havoc. The one place that they never venture is Port Luna, for all of Malavera knows never to descend to the seaside before the sun had broke over the horizon. Stories of disappearances and unexplained occurrences led to the superstitions and urban legends of deceiving demons and malevolent spirits hunting the area. Instead, these creatures, for they could never be called human, roam the streets throughout the rest of the city, a nightly disease that infects the city once dusk falls that is purged as soon as the sun rises. Life here is almost unthinkably dangerous. And yet, I call Malavera home. The grim undertakings of the nocturnal do not consist of life in Malavera. Rather, as a mere part of life during the day, the city is an entirely different place. The oceanside air carries a scent of tranquility and freshness through the streets. The people who fill the roads with the daily hustle and bustle are polite and kind, and I used to have friends among them. The sun overhead shines down, and when I look out to sea from the port and behold the glistening water shimmering beneath the warm sunlight, I think that there is no jewel upon this earth that can rival its beauty. If the city truly is cursed, it only reveals itself at night, when the sky takes on that dark blue hue. The clouds fade under the cover of night. Families retreat into their homes and lock the doors, and the sea loses that glimmering beauty. I, too, barricade myself in my quarters to wait out another night. It has been that way for as long as I can remember, and it will be this way until the ocean itself rises, seizes the city in its wet grip, and drags Malavera down to the briny depths. I would be content with this crude system were it not for a particular night that I spent outside the safety of my home. I am a man who has survived a Malavera night, but at the unexpected cost of my very sanity. Whatever still dwindles within my head presents you with what I can recollect of that terrible night, but with this dire warning. Never go outside in Malavera at night. I was a young man of about 24 years when it happened, and I am ashamed to admit I was not of an agreeable reputation. Indeed, I made mistakes in my life regarding my career choices, though were it not so damned easy, I would not have been bothered. At my side was a fellow whom I had long revered and called a friend. His name was Amicus, and together we managed to successfully swindle many sailors out of their money. Our original scam was a relatively simple one. In addition to docks holding large ships from faraway places, Port Luna also held a thriving market that began at dawn and ended shortly before dusk. Sailors would come to trade with the local merchants, and Amicus and I would disguise ourselves as such in order to fool the sailors into buying our goods. The items in question, such as fruit or spices, were actually purchased from other stalls. We would then sell them to eager sailors for twice the price, which meant that we would purchase a dozen apples or oranges for 6 pieces, and then sell them to sailors for 12 or 13 on days that we felt particularly bold. On one occasion, we sold a dozen oranges to a group for 30 pieces. They were outraged, but begrudgingly paid the 30 pieces after we informed them that, due to a drought, it had been a difficult season for harvest. The sailors, who had been out to sea for so long that they had become desperately in need of fruit, were pitifully easy to fool. Over time, our scams became more elaborate. We would take simple balls and paint them to resemble fruit before filling a crate with them, stacking real fruit on top in order to conceal the deceit. We would then deliver the crate to a newly arrived ship for the ludicrous price of 50 pieces. And the captain, upon inspecting the fruit on the top, would pay us. Soon we realized that painting all of the balls was unnecessary effort, and instead wedged a large piece of cardboard halfway into the box, filled the bottom part beneath it with sand to make up for the difference of weight and give the illusion of it being full of fruit. We garnered a notorious reputation around Port Luna, though our tricks continued to prove effective for many months, as sailors would not fathom our treachery until they had long departed out into the sea, at which point it was far too late to voyage back to Malavera. Of those who were so infuriated they returned to port to seek us out, we would simply leave the port and not return until we were absolutely sure that it was safe. It was in this fashion that we operated for months, until the day came that I had never anticipated would find me trapped on the streets of Malavera after dark. Amicus and I were convincing the captain of a crew of newly arrived sailors of the quality of our product, which, for the curious, was a simple crate containing a dozen or so oranges, our carefully made fakes, in the sand. When a delivery boy happened to pass from the same stall that had sold us the oranges a week prior. He caught on to our trick once he spotted the oranges and loudly informed the captain of our attempted trickery, and stated that the oranges were not only soon to be overripe, but were no longer fresh. However, the captain still seemed uncertain, and we may have still salvaged the scam with our pride intact had the delivery boy not gestured to Amicus's face and declared it a dishonest face. This short remark irritated Amicus so fiercely that he, holding the crate with one arm, made the boy grab with the other hand and was so careless as to let the crate fall from his grip. Upon hitting the dock, the crate broke in half, spilling ripe fruit, balls, and sand at the captain's feet. He must have been warned of our scams by other sailors, for at the revelation of our deception, his face became quite red and he reached for the cutlass at his belt. The first few raindrops of a seaside storm fell as Amicus and I hurried away, leaving the crate where it lay, like a monument of our shameful falsehoods on the dock. Amicus and I were forced to flee from the wrath of not only the sailors, but the police overseeing the market when the delivery boy alerted them to our tricks. Amicus and I tore out of Port Luna into the streets, spurred onward by that fabled adrenaline rush of fear as the sailors yelled profanity as they pursued us, and the policemen blew their whistles as they attempted to maintain order. I remember roughly bumping into a woman on the street as I hastened to keep pace with my friend, knocking her to the ground and sending the foods that she had been carrying in a basket into the air, though I hardly noticed at the time. Instead, all that mattered was our escape. Fortunately, at that moment, the clouds opened and a downpour of rain fell. Seaside storms are hazardous, and in the chaos as people fought for shelter, Amicus and I believed that we would make our getaway down an alleyway until we heard the captain's boots still clamoring after us in a determined hunt. I could feel the polished blade of his cutlass whistle through the wind behind me. At that very moment, much to my relief, his foot landed on a recently made puddle of rainwater and he slipped and fell onto the cobblestone. Amicus and I were free to make our getaway, but at that moment, some fool pulled a large horse carriage at the end of the alley and stopped, blocking our road of escape. Behind us, I could hear the captain rising to his feet to resume his chase. Our time to escape was limited, and I began to panic. The driver had stopped his carriage with the wheel blocking any hope that we had of climbing beneath it. Amicus did not hesitate. With his superior height, he leaped into the air and seized hold of the carriage's roof. His boots kicked the side of the carriage as he pulled himself atop it, and he looked back to cast me one last pitying look before he disappeared over the other side of the carriage, leaving me to my fate. The captain advanced upon me, but at that moment, a policeman appeared at the far end of the alleyway, loudly blowing his whistle. The captain lowered his cutlass in confusion and turned away from me to face back to the policeman. Behind me, the door to the carriage opened and a man in a black hood, a man whom I presumed to be the carriage driver, peered out at the scene in the alleyway. I wasted no time in pushing the man out of my way and climbing into his carriage before opening the door on the other side and tumbling out, falling to the ground in the process and dirtying the sleeve of my jacket with flecks of mud. Behind me, the man in the black hood closed the doors to the carriage and whipped the reins, spurring the horses onward. I fought to climb to my feet, and I fled, leaving the encounter with the captain behind me. I wandered through the streets of Malaveira, but there was no sign of Amicus. The rain fell like a veil, cloaking the figures on the streets from my view, making it even more difficult to find my friend. The storm was overpowering me now. A screaming gale nearly forced me off my feet. I knew at once that I should seek shelter. Unfortunately, or through some cruel karmic retribution by the will of an angry god, my residence was on the other side of Malaveira. The storm was growing in intensity, so much so that debris was beginning to fly amongst the fierce winds. Water was flooding the streets as puddles formed, overflowed, and grew to consume the bricks. I was desperately in need of a place to wait out the storm, so I began searching the shops that adorned the sides of the street for one that was open to no avail. It was getting far too late for any respectable establishment to have its doors open to customers. Rather unwillingly, I found myself huddled deep in an alleyway. The rain soaked my clothes and chilled me down to the bone. It was there that I suffered for an unknowable amount of time, though the buildings around me weakened the wind to a slight frigid breeze, and the downpour was barely tolerable. By the time the rain stopped, I was shivering. My clothes were damp, and each movement that I made sent droplets of water flying from my body. My shoes were nearly ruined from being submerged for so long in the growing ocean that had once been the street, and my toes were numb from the icy temperature. When I exhaled, a cloud of white mist emerged from my mouth, and my spine would quiver. I was shaking, though I know not if it was from the unbearable cold or the sudden realization of my predicament. Even from where I was hidden in an alleyway, I could see the sky above, even though I already knew what would be waiting for me, my stomach sunk deeper and deeper as I slowly left my refuge for the Malaveran streets, my gaze still fixated on the sky. A waning gibbous moon cloaked behind clouds of stone hung within an abyss of black that sparkled with white stars. I was in disbelief, though I could not tear my eyes from the sight of a night sky. I hadn't seen one in so long, and believed that I never would so long as I lived in Malaveara. But here I was. I was so suddenly overcome with emotions of such a powerful fear that when I finally did manage to tear my gaze from the moon, my face contorted in a wide smile, and I began to laugh until tears were streaming down my cheeks and my breathing had turned ragged and tired. A memory of an event that had taken place mere months before that night had come to mind as I stood shaking in the frosty night. I had been in my den taking shelter for the night when from outside came a sudden ruckus. A panicking man was running from house to house, banging on the doors. Even now, so many years later, I can remember the sound of his screams. "I'm not one of them. I don't belong out here," he was shouting, pleading to be let inside. I had the blinds pulled over the windows, yet I still ducked down in front of my desk when he came to my door and rapped his fists on the wood. "Please, somebody! They're coming!" I froze in place. I did not dare to rise from my chair. From where I was safe inside my own home, I listened to the man attempt to rush to the next house, but I never heard him knock on the door. He began to scream, and then his screams turned to howls, and the howls to whimpers before all outside was silent. As quietly as I could, I rose from my chair and went to my bedroom before closing and locking the door and tiredly climbing into bed, where I would toss and turn for the rest of the night. The morning after, I left my home to see a tattered jacket lying in the street in the same area that the man had been shouting. People trampled on it as they made their way down the street. Was that to be my fate? To fall victim to whatever foul nightmares prowl the streets in the darkness? It appeared that my only chance for survival would be to seek shelter at my own home on the other side of Malaveara. I feared that if I remained in place much longer, whatever unseen monstrosities that I had heard every night would soon be upon me. I had no time to waste and began my long trek. I strode along the streets, weary to be traveling in plain sight. I looked to the shadows of the alleyway, thinking that they would prove me an invaluable hiding place. But the darkness was so absolute that I could not tell if there was anything moving within the shadows, and it was then that I caught my first glimpse of a denizen of the night. He looked to be old, as his hair was ashen and his black eyes seemed sunken and filled with a hollowness dug through the years. His crooked teeth smiled at me beneath a wide-brimmed black hat, and his black trench coat seemed long, almost too long. He was a tall man, so tall in fact that at first I believed he was levitating in the air. Startled by his sudden appearance, I quickened my pace, leaving that vile alleyway behind me. I dared not look back over my shoulder for fear that he would be following. It wasn't until I reached the end of the street that I ventured a quick glance over my shoulder and saw, to my immense relief, that there was no one. My relief was short-lived as I looked back down the street and was met with a shock. I was fully aware that the amount of nighttime ghouls wandering the streets of Malaveara was vast, though I was not aware of the full scope until that very moment. The street was lined with a wide array of strange creatures, and I now knew that my assumption of these nighttime stalkers not being human proved true. The pungent stench of decay and squalor filled my nostrils as I stood paralyzed by the horrifying sight before me. Creatures sat in doorways, motionless, paced the streets restless, or stood huddled in unsettlingly close circles, whispering in undiscernible voices. None of these nocturnal freaks seemed to pay me any attention, however, so I wondered if it might be possible to simply walk down the street. My only other option was to detour through an alleyway, but without knowing what sinister entities lurked in the shadows, I could not bring myself to enter the alley. Trying to keep myself from shaking so harshly, I began walking down the street and past the ghouls. As I wandered past a circle of people who had no color to them whatsoever, not on their skin or clothing, I could catch only a few select words. Catalyst, crystal, gates, oblivion. Before the group went silent when I approached while keeping their heads bowed in the circle, unmoving. I passed by a man in a faded gray cloak who was lying against a shop and peered at him as I passed, only to discover to my horror that he had no face beneath his hood. Though as I stared, 2 eyes began to push outwards through his skin before the skin opened, pushing the eyeballs out onto his face where their brilliant blue radiance watched me. When more eyes began to appear on his cheeks, forehead, and chin, I walked a little faster and hurried away while feeling the heat of their intense gazes on my back. It took everything that I had to not break into a sprint, though my face glistened with sweat, and I now buried my hands in my pockets to hide the shaking. My breathing was heavy, and I struggled to quiet my gasps. At this point, I hadn't even made it halfway down the street. Nothing about this was natural. The monsters were real, and they had come. I passed another circle of colorless people, catching a few more words. Ends, Corsair, Syndicate. But I was almost wheezing. Finally, I reached the end of the street where a raven-haired woman wearing black clothing and holding a white umbrella was standing with her back to me. She looked around at me and caught my eye. Her face was pale, her skin almost ghostly. The lady turned to face me, slowly reaching out a weak hand. "Please, are you here for me?" she asked in a voice that was little more than a whisper. "So empty. So cold." No, I stammered, backing away as the empty lady slowly moved closer, her hand still extended. "I'm sorry, I can't help." Suddenly, a rough hand clamped down on my shoulder and pulled me so violently that I was nearly yanked off my feet. Instead, I whirled around to find that a sailor, covered completely from head to toe in a muddy grime, had grabbed me in his cold, unyielding grasp. His eyes flashed darkly, filled with a bitter malevolence, but his beard seemed to be made of something other than hair. I felt my stomach sink when I saw his beard move and realized that it was made of fingers, some twitching, others pointing towards me as if trying to grab me. "You ain't one of us," he croaked in a hollow, grovelly voice that sounded as though it had come from an abyss at the end of the ocean floor. "Ye don't belong here." "Let go of me!" I struggled to pull away from his hold. The empty lady was still crooning behind me. He was slowly pushing his face closer to mine, and the fingers reached out for me. At the last second, I pulled my head back and threw it forward, feeling a satisfying crack where his nose was as he stumbled back, releasing me from his powerful grip. But the clammy fingers seized hold of my face. Shrieking, I pulled away, but the fingers did not relinquish their hold. His beard stretched as though he had a long arm protruding from his face, and I could hear the gruesome sailors cackling in my ears. It was only when I opened my mouth and bit down on the fingers trying to climb inside that he howled in pain, and the fingers retracted. Disoriented, I scrambled to get away, my footsteps sounding like thunder on the bricks as I ran for my life. I paid no attention to the freaks lining the streets or the circles that went silent as I neared. Instead, I was so caught up in my mad dash to even remember which direction I was going. All that mattered was getting away from the monsters, but that feat was impossible in a city filled with them. My fearful run began to garner the attention of the creatures. Some seemed uninterested, others called after me, but some lunged to catch me. A woman with long, greasy black hair dove at me from a familiar alleyway, her lips parting sideways to reveal jagged, broken teeth, and she hissed at me. Panicking, I nearly lost my balance trying to turn in a new direction and ended up running beneath an archway into Port Luna, the nocturnal, forbidden area where no stalkers would dare wander after dark, for forces far more chaotic and malign than they inhabited this area. For a moment, I thought I caught sight of the ghostly sailor wandering the edge of the port with a lantern in hand. But his beard was not as proclaimed, and he was wearing the garb of a captain. The sudden howling of a wolf somewhere nearby startled me, and I reflexively tensed up at the sudden sound before it abruptly stopped. Everything seemed so quiet in the port, which I thought was odd at the time, but the reason why did not occur to me until much later. During the day, in addition to the rowdiness of the market, there was the constant crashing of waves against the docks and the squawking of seagulls. That night, the ocean was impossibly silent, and the only living things were watching from the shadows, their presence felt but unheard. I so desperately wanted to run from that unholy place, but my feet seemed locked in place. I was paralyzed with fear, my whole body tingling with shivers. It suddenly became very cold. When I looked out over the ocean, the moon did not illuminate the waves. Instead, the water was blacker than the sky, so it more resembled an endless abyss yawning over the horizon. It felt as though my blood were turning to ice as I stared, numb, at the unnatural, unrecognizable sight before me. Rather unexpectedly, I felt an ancient presence nearby, and all of the other malevolent entities seemed to disappear as it drew nearer. Sweat rolled down my brow as I felt it moving over the cobblestone to my side, but I did not dare to look. Instead, I stood in mute terror, trembling and squeezing my eyes shut, praying that tonight was not the night that I met an untimely demise. When I opened my eyes, the ancient creature passed me by, and I caught my first sight of its massive form. From what little that I can remember, it had skin whiter than anything I'd ever seen, and it seemed to be twisted and pulsating while it prowled on 4 legs. Whether they ended in paws or claws or some other appendage, I did not see. It turned to face me with a deformed face, though I could somehow tell that it held a mildly interesting, musing expression. Its eyes were hollow, but all-seeing. Its mouth was permanently open, as though it had not finished what it had to say, and it never would. This indescribable creature surveyed me for a moment, and then it spoke in a voice unlike any human's. This voice that a human would be incapable of making, for it resonated with eons of life and whispers of debilitation. It did not move its mouth to say those 3 words that have haunted me ever since that night, echoing in my dreams and hiding between the sentences of everything that anyone has spoken to me since. At once, I regained control of my body and turned to flee from that repulsive port, and I have never returned. I do not recall how exactly I returned home, for my mind was a spiral of madness for many months after my encounter with the ancient entity. But despite my slow recovery, I have not remembered. Even most of the creature's form is a blur in my memory, as the mere sight unraveled my mind for quite some time. From what I've been told, I was found in my house the next day, raving like a madman and laughing to myself. I spent many years in a recovery clinic, and I have not seen Amicus since his abandonment that night. Now, years later, I live my life quietly in Malavera. I found honest work and am often inside my house hours before and after night falls over the fair city. Somehow, I know that I will never be able to leave. But those 3 words that the creature spoke are forever ingrained in my mind. Even writing them now sends shivers down my back and a dull pain through my head. Despite my uncountable nightmares about the ancient entity saying those 3 words, I've tried to forget. I now write them, hoping that I find some solace in revealing my knowledge and praying whomever reads them will someday find that they do not remember these 3 words. Welcome home, human. Well then, that had a very Cthulhuan vibe to it, if I do say so myself. What about you guys? I think you guys think the same thing, right? All right. Next up on the list. Yeah, it definitely had a Lovecraftian vibe. I thought that was pretty cool. All right. It's all good, Jeff. You're just in time for part 2 of Miss Marnie's Tea House. Here we go. July 14th, 1976. Vietnamese Marble Mountain Black Tea. Tea with a very interesting legend. It's said that a dragon laid an egg on Non Nuoc Beach, and after 1,000 days and nights, it hatched a beautiful woman. The shell, left in 5 pieces, became the 5 Marble Mountains. Good for cases of import that are otherwise unmanageable. Warning: exercise extreme caution with this tea. When brewed according to proper ritual, this tea is as dangerous to the conjurer as it is to the victim. Use only when absolutely necessary. My mother's leather-bound tea journal has come in handy many times over the years, for though she had taught me from a young age the proper methods of brewing tea, there was still a lot I needed to learn by the time she passed. Now that she's gone, it is immensely helpful to have a little reference book of the more rare teas of her collection. I scanned the page several times, wincing at the giant letters, "Exercise extreme caution indeed." I wondered for a moment if my mother would be disappointed that I was using her tea for this, but then again, it was an emergency. When going head-to-head with a formidable opponent, one must use only the most appropriate weapons in one's arsenal. And this was mine. Vietnamese Marble Mountain Black Tea. I caressed the wooden chest that she kept it in, fingering the heavy lock as I withdrew the key from around my neck. She kept all her rare tea in the chest, and it wasn't until she passed that I finally was given ownership of it. This was the very first time, in fact, that I would be opening it myself. This should have been a sacred moment, really. I should have been selecting a tea to help somebody, to cure someone of chronic pain, to make them forget a lost love, or perhaps to help them remember that love even more clearly. My feelings shouldn't be tinged with anger and hate. I shouldn't be opening this chest out of spite. Then again, I was doing this for a cause. In the end, I was saving myself. And sometimes you have to help yourself before you can help anyone else. Obviously, I'm not the only one of my kind out there. There are many beings that possess similar abilities. No, not all of them brew tea. Not all of them are women. Hell, not all of them are people. The world is a very strange, mysterious place full of odd things. And some odd things happen to be very territorial. I became aware that someone had encroached on my territory almost immediately. Probably because the attack was instantaneous. One morning I was brewing Black Dragon Pearl's black tea. As I watched the little pearls unfold in the hot water, the leaves twisting and writhing in a dance commonly called the agony of the leaves, I began to notice an odd sheen to the water. I had barely a moment to register the anomaly when the leaves began to transform into grasshoppers. Grasshoppers. Disgusting, filthy, pathetic grasshoppers. I screamed as my hands began to tremble around my glass teapot. I itched to throw the glass across the room, but I knew it would shatter and the grasshoppers would be free. And once they were, they'd come for me. So, instead, I waited for several long minutes in agony as I watched them boil to death. Only when I was sure that they had all died did I take the teapot to the trash bin outside and throw the whole mess away, slamming the lid in equal parts fear and anger. If this seems odd, then allow me to elaborate. To my kind, grasshoppers are a curse. To you, they may seem harmless, but we know better. We know what hell they bring. Someone had snuck into my tea house and contaminated my sanctuary. This was not a prank or even a warning. It was more than a threat. It was a deadly attack, one heavy with intent. Somebody wanted me dead and gone, and if I didn't put a stop to it, I would be. At least sniffing out my foe proved to be an easy feat. After all, even I had heard of the new bakery that had opened up down the street. Although it had only opened a few weeks prior, it had skyrocketed in popularity, and its customers claimed that its sweets and treats were unmatched within 1,000 miles. That's how I knew I was dealing with a novice. They were utterly lacking in subtlety. Then again, it wouldn't do to underestimate my enemy, as they would obviously be prepared for a counterattack if their initial attack failed. They would be waiting for my response. So whatever course of action I chose would have to be very impressive. Once I had the name of the new baker in town, Alessandra, if you'd like to know, I put my plan into action. It would have been better if I'd had the opportunity to investigate her a little more, find out more about her, but any such move on my part would have alerted her immediately to what I was doing. Better to go with the strongest attack available to me and wait for the results. So, in the dark of night, I chose a fate for both Alessandra and myself, and prayed to whatever could hear me that I would escape this ordeal alive. I sat in the middle of the tea house floor, surrounded by 5 empty teacups, pieces from the finest cast iron set that I own. It was dusk, the fading light indicative of my increase in power. Magic, it so happens, is always stronger in the dark, when it becomes possible to see reality without the handicap of vision. First, I had washed the leaves in hot water, rinsing them thoroughly to remove any impurities. Then I began the first steep. I let the tea steep for exactly 3 minutes and 33 seconds before dividing the water between the 5 teacups. I repeated this process 10 times until I had 11 steeps and the cups were full to the brim, just shy of overflowing. Now, one of the unique characteristics of this tea is that the tip of each leaf is golden color. I selected 5 fresh leaves and placed them each in the 5 teacups. The golden tips pointed skywards. And then, I waited. Fortunately, I didn't have to wait long. A thick steam began to rise up from the cups, eventually clouding the room with fog, my skin burning from the heat. As the temperature continued to climb, I longed to run from my tea house into the cool night air, into freedom, but I remained seated, waiting for an appearance. After what felt like an eternity, but I knew to be only another 3 minutes and 33 seconds, the fog cleared. From out the shadows of my family's tea house stepped a woman. To call her beautiful would be a pathetic error. She was the very definition of ethereality. Her black hair flowing past her waist, the hue of her skin that of burnt chestnuts, the lilt of her eyes hypnotic. To look at her was to fall in love. She was reminiscent of a poem I'd once studied by a famed Chinese poet. In lauding the beauty of his own sister to the emperor, he wrote, "A rare beauty in the north, one of a kind she stands alone. One look from her will fell a city. A second look will leave the country in ruins. It is better not to know if a city or country will fall. but know that such a beauty is hard to find. In that moment, I felt that she embodied the beauty of the poem. She was so perfect. She ensured destruction. I myself loved her desperately as soon as she stepped within the circle of the teacups and reached for me. If only I were to reach back and take her hand, I was sure she would bring me to pleasures that I had never seen before. Instead, I said, "I'm your master. I am the conjurer." She nodded, her hair gleaming in the low candlelight as she said, "What is it you command?" I crooked a smile and said, "Alessandra Winters." She smiled in return, and I knew that she understood. At that, I stood up, gazing at her from eye level, wondering if I would be strong enough for what was to come. I could feel a hint of bitterness in my voice as I spoke, though I was desperate to conceal it. "Perfect. You will be my Zishi." The next morning, the woman departed, wearing a set of clothing that had once belonged to my older sister before her death. Although she would not reveal her true name, she agreed to let me choose a name for her, at least for the duration of her time on Earth. I called her Annalise. I watched her leave with an ache in my heart, knowing that she had captured my desire. It would be torture to watch her complete her mission. I only hoped that the end result would be worth it. That day, she arrived at Alessandra's bakery, and I once again steeped a cup of Marble Mountain. By inhaling its steam, I was able to see visions of Annalise's progress. Even as it pained me to watch, I couldn't bring myself to look away. Alessandra was a beautiful woman herself, with plump curves and honey blonde hair. It was clear that she was taken by Annalise at first sight, just as I was. Like I said, it was impossible to look at Annalise and not love her. Annalise made the barest hint of flirtation, and it was enough. Alessandra embraced her, and Annalise allowed herself to be taken to bed. The week that followed was a nightmare. Alessandra and Annalise spent all their time together. My visions told me that much. They lazed around in bed, laughing and sharing intimate glances. They derived countless hours of pleasure from each other's bodies, chasing the ends of bliss with pure sensuality. Annalise was exactly how I knew she'd be, sweet and attentive and caring. She showered Alessandra with love, and Alessandra fell a helpless victim to her wiles. It was a special kind of torment, watching the love of my life seduce another woman, but I was at least satisfied with the immediate results. Alessandra let her bakery go to waste. She didn't even bother to take the sweets out of the window, letting them grow moldy for everyone to see. She lost more and more of her will to exist as an independent entity. She was powerless to deny her attraction to Annalise. By the end of the week, she was exactly as vulnerable as I needed her to be. She was ready for the grand finale that I had planned, the goal of the entire endeavor. As Alessandra slept for a few short hours after their lovemaking, I called Annalise to reappear before me and instructed her to end it. The sweetness in her smile was a poison I'd happily drink. And so I sat with my cup of tea, my skin seared red from the steam, waiting and watching for the results of Annalise's attentions. The only thing more endearing than Annalise herself was watching her work. I watched, spellbound, as she crawled into her lover's bed, shaking Alessandra from her slumber. My enemy smiled drowsily as Annalise drew her hand back. She plunged it hard into Alessandra's ribcage, the forbidding strength of her fingernails scraping at her internal organs. Alessandra's eyes went wide as she screamed, and Annalise took that as an opportunity to snap forward and bite at her left eyeball, snagging a chunk of it and drawing it into her mouth. I watched the pus paint her lips, and a shudder of pleasure rippled through my body. Alessandra continued to scream as Annalise's left hand joined her right, ripping into the baker's torso and shredding her organs to ribbons. The blood coated Annalise's arms, a stark contrast to her tan skin. She was beautiful naked, but she was magnificent, bathed in gore. As she continued to tear apart Alessandra's body, I found myself wishing to see her so clothed for the rest of my life. After a great length of time, the screaming stopped. Alessandra lay in pieces on the bed, one of her arms torn from its socket and hanging loosely by its shredded muscles. The flesh on her face clawed away, her torso flayed open and internally rearranged. She was a masterpiece, one that I had helped create. I sat with my tea for a long time, staring at the scene in my mind's eye, until I was pulled from my thoughts by a sudden awareness that Annalise was standing in front of me. She and I stared at each other for an endless moment, each assessing the other. The look in her eyes was triumphant, exultant, but not satisfied. She licked her lips, and then she asked, "Do you want me?" "Yes," my mind screamed in a frenzy. "God, yes, more than anything." Instead, I answered, "No," even as I felt my soul burning from such a despicable lie. She smiled at me one last time, a conspiratorial smile, before vanishing like the impossibility that she was, and I was left alone to my thoughts. At the end of the day, I suppose I got exactly what I wanted. Alessandra's body was found only a few days later, and her story became the stuff of urban legends, particularly as her killer was never found. Annalise, for all intents and purposes, never existed. No DNA, no fingerprints, nothing. As for me, well, there was nothing connecting me to Alessandra in the first place. Not only was she dead, but I had also succeeded in sending a strong message to future competition. This is my territory. This is my home. Those who intrude upon it shall suffer. My tea house is doing better than ever, particularly as I've started serving some sweets and delicacies from other cultures that are traditionally eaten with tea. People seem all too happy to continue their patronage of my little shop. Business is blossoming, and I know I should be pleased. Sometimes I am. But there are some nights when I'm alone in my quiet little townhouse that memories of Annalise flash before my eyes like snapshots of perfections, calling out to me, beckoning me. If ever I have come close to understanding love, surely it was then, looking at her halo of gore, worshipping the savage light in her eyes. There are some nights I wonder if it was really worth it, sending her to the enemy and depriving myself of the only love that would ever matter, even knowing that it would end in a wretched death. Some nights, I even think of conjuring her again and giving myself over to that suicidal temptation. Dangerous tea, indeed. Well, that was fun. All right. Next up, we have Red Lights by Daniel Martins. And here is the link to the story. Feel free to read with me as I read aloud. Welcome to all those who came in the middle of the story reading. Appreciate you stopping by, and please feel free to stick around and enjoy the rest of the stories that are to come. Every family has its stories, those events that have passed on into almost legend, and my extended family is no different. Some families have stories which they laugh about, which are brought up with regularity at gatherings, stories that they share with others. Ours is not one of those stories. If it's discussed at all, it's spoken about in hushed tones, with sideways glances at me in particular. I never bring it up myself unless directly asked, and I'm lucky enough that I can get away with telling people that I was too young, that I don't remember the details, that it's just a blur in a distant memory from my youth. But that's a lie. I remember almost everything. I remember every time I have to look at myself in the mirror, and the nightmares still make me sit bolt upright in bed at night, gasping for breath and terrified. The event that became family legend took place 2 decades ago now, when I was about 8 years old. We were heading for a short family getaway to our family's cabin. To be honest, it was more of a holiday home than a cabin. My grandparents had bought it when my father was still young, and it had been in the family for years. My brother and I called it the cabin by the woods. Made it sound more exotic. My grandfather used to take my dad and his siblings up there when they were young, hiking through the woods, fishing and swimming in the nearby lake. And my dad and his family and did the same with their own families. We started the trip when I was about 6. Mom, Dad, me, and my little brother Peter heading up to the cabin for the odd weekend getaway. I vaguely remember a few of those earlier trips. I recall swimming in the lake with Pete one time and both of us being scared to go too far out because that was where the lake weeds started growing and you couldn't see the bottom. The cabin was right on the edge of the woods, right along the boundary of the tree line. Fields and farmland on one side and heavy woodland on the other. The farm next to the site was owned by the Johnson family, old friends of my grandparents. We'd always stop in and say hi to Mr. and Mrs. Johnson on the way up to stay. Occasionally we'd have dinner there. My dad and his siblings had played with the Johnson kids when they were younger, but their children had grown up and moved away, and it was just the parents left at the time. Mr. Johnson kept an eye on the cabin when our family wasn't using it. Dad had pulled us out of school a few days before the weekend. We packed up the car and left early on Thursday morning. It was late summer, the leaves were just starting to change color, and the air was becoming crisp and cool in the evenings. I remember being excited for the trip. I was looking forward to adventuring in the woods, and Pete wanted to go swimming. Mom had warned us that it might still be too cold to get in the lake, but we insisted on packing our swimsuits anyway, just in case. Marty! Pete! My mom was calling to us to head out, but Pete and I were in the car and ready early, eager to set off. Pete had decided he was going to put on his swimming trunks underneath his pants so that he'd be ready to go at a moment's notice once we were there. The drive was uneventful. We napped in the back of the car. I remember waking up as we pulled up the gravel driveway to the cabin. Dad must have picked up the keys from the Johnsons on the drive-in while I was still asleep. We bumped our way up to the long, twisted driveway that ran along the tree line. We slowed to a halt outside the cabin. Pete and I looked excitedly out of the car windows. It looked just like I remembered it, framed by big trees with a clear area in front of which attached to the field that bordered the woods. The Johnsons' fence line ran along the edge of the woods, and normally there would be stock roaming around in the field. They had sheep and some cattle, but today it was empty. Pete was bouncing excitedly in his seat. "I want to go swimming!" he yelled. "We need to unpack the car and set everything out first, bud," Dad replied, opening his door and getting out. "Please?" Mom got out as well and unbuckled Pete. I got out on my own and looked around. Everything was as I remembered it. Looking off to the side of the cabin, I could see the gaps in the trees where twin paths forked off, one leading into the woods and one leading the other way, down towards the lake. There was a white blaze painted on one of the trees, marking the start of the path. You know, I could take them, Mom said to Dad. We can always unpack later. We've got plenty of time. Dad opened the trunk and grabbed his and Mom's bags out. Okay, let's just quickly dump our bags inside and we'll get changed and go down to the lake. Yay! Pete deafened us all and began to run around the car until Mom snagged him in a hug. Dad grinned and hefted the bags across the covered porch to the cabin's door. Dropping them to one side, he fumbled with his keys and opened the door, then froze in the doorway. Dad? I asked, unable to see past him into the shadowy inside. Get your brother and get back in the car, Dad said without looking at me. But right now, Marty. Dad cut me off using his serious tone. Dear? Mom sounded concerned as I grabbed Pete and pulled him towards the car while he protested loudly. Where's the axe kept? Where did we find it last time? Oh, God, what's wrong? Mom's voice rose slightly as Dad came back towards the car and hefted the tire iron out of the trunk, striding quickly back towards the open door. The place is all messed up. I think there might have been a break-in. The axe was in the laundry last time, I think. Be careful, she trailed off, sounding worried. I'll be fine. Stay here. Dad quickly kissed her on the cheek before stepping through the open door, tire iron half raised in his right hand. Mom paced back and forth by the car, clearly concerned, and we sat in the back looking toward the cabin. We sat there for what seemed like an age, becoming more and more worried as the seconds went on. What's happening, Marty? Is Dad okay? I tried to reassure Pete. Everything's fine. Dad's tough. There's nothing that he can't deal with. I remember Dad once telling me that I had an overactive imagination, and this was one of those situations where it was free to run wild. Even as I spoke, I found myself imagining all of the horrific things that surely lurked inside the cabin, just waiting for Dad to stumble upon them, and I could feel my fear levels rising. In my mind, I saw dark shapes moving about in the gloom, silently stalking my father, and how they would come for us once they'd gotten him. I looked back towards the cabin, and suddenly the curtains in the front window were flung open, Dad looking out the window. We saw him walk around to the door and come back outside holding an axe, which he propped up against the front of the cabin. Looks like everything is fine, guys. You can come out of the car now. He went and talked to Mom. How about you take the kids down to the lake while I get everything straightened up? He explained to Mom that the place was a bit messed up, but not too badly. A fallen branch had smashed in a window at the back of the place, and he thought that a raccoon or something had gotten in and turned over some things while hunting for food. He'd found the axe in the laundry where it was meant to be. Dad thought that it must have happened in the last day or so, after Mr. Johnson had come to turn the power and water on. The scary things I had imagined quickly receded in my thoughts, but I remember still feeling vaguely uneasy. Pete was still excited to go swimming, so Mom got our swimming stuff and the three of us headed down to the lake while Dad went back inside. We'll be about a half hour, dear, Mom shouted to Dad as we headed around the cabin and down towards the woodland path that would take us to the lake. Swimming was fun, I remember, splashing around in the water with Pete while the sun shone brightly down on us. We were lucky that it wasn't starting to get really cold yet, since we were just getting into the start of autumn. Mom read her book on the shore while Pete and I swam around the shallows, once again avoiding the lake weed. Eventually, Mom called us back in and we got dried off and headed back up to the cabin. Dad had cleaned the place up and nailed an old board over the broken window at the back. He told us to grab our bags and go set up in our bedroom. We grabbed our gear and ran through the lounge area down the hall to the bedroom. He immediately claimed the top bunk, struggled up the ladder, decided it was too high, that he'd fall out in the night, and then claimed the bottom bunk. We unpacked our sleeping bags and then ran back down the hallway into the lounge. Mom and Dad had finished unpacking the rest of the car. They'd stowed the food in the kitchen, and Dad was setting up the portable grill out on the porch. Can we go exploring? I asked excitedly. I liked the woods. I remembered playing games in them last time with Pete, pretending we were mighty heroes defending a fortress from an invading barbarian horde. There was a spot I had in mind where the narrow, winding path opened up, leading into an area where the trees widened out, and there was space to run around and play. I recalled a bank on one side of the clearing, which we'd climbed to make our fortress. Sure, Dad smiled, but He was using a serious voice again. I want you to look after your brother. Don't let him out of your sight. Don't be away too long, stay on the path, and don't go any deeper than that clearing we went to last time. Don't worry, Dad, I yelled, grabbed Pete, and running off together while Dad was still talking. We sprinted towards the path that would take us into the woods and were suddenly plunged into darkness when we hit the tree line. I realized that we'd been standing out in the bright sun and it was just taking our eyes a second to adjust. Pete stooped to pick up a hefty stick. This is my sword, he yelled. To be honest, it was much more of a mace than a sword. The pointy end was a bit bigger than the end he was holding, and quite knobbly. He had to hold it with both hands to easily control it. Nice, I said, grinning. I'll find one of my own. We headed down the path together, going deeper into the woods. The path snaked around between trees, over rises, and down through small gullies, and the occasional tree had a white blaze painted on it as a path marker. It was cool, with the bright sun being blocked above by the tree canopy. A few minutes later, the path opened up and we stepped into the clearing. The tree canopy still blocked out most of the sky, but was thin enough so that the clearing was fairly well lit. We ran around and played for a while, taking turns to guard and assault the fortress, and then both guarding it while we repelled the invading force. After a while, we were breathing heavily from all the running around and we sat down for a break. Where does that path go? Pete was looking around, pointing towards the far side of the clearing. I looked in the direction he was pointing and spotted a tree with another white blaze painted on it on the far side of the clearing. The path was hard to spot next to the tree. It seemed to be quite overgrown, and the tree that was marked was gnarled and twisted with only a few leaves still attached. It was covered in moss or lichen, which made the blaze a lot harder to see than normal. I don't know, I replied. Let's find out. I stood picking up my sword stick, and Pete picked up his too. Didn't Dad say not to go any further? Pete sounded worried that we'd get in trouble. Come on, we'll be fine. I was using my big brother powers of persuasion, knowing that Pete would cave in and come with me if I headed that way. I was soon proven right as we headed towards the path together. We were less than a minute past the gnarled marker tree when a sense of unease settled in. The woods felt different. There was less light and the trees were closer together. They seemed to be fighting each other, clawing their way up towards the light. I no longer felt the confidence that I had before, and I gripped my stick a little tighter, taking some comfort from its weight. Marnie, did you hear that? Pete asked, clutching at my arm. Hear what? I don't know. Like something moving around? Something big, I think. He trailed off as we slowed our pace to a near crawl, and I listened hard. I hadn't heard anything, but at that moment I realized I couldn't hear much of anything at all. The woods were normally full of sounds, the rustling of wind through the trees, bird song and the like, but it seemed eerily quiet all of a sudden. We heard the snap of a twig behind us and froze in place, the hair on the back of my neck prickling and standing on end. Pete slowly turned his head to look at me, and I slowly turned to look at him. His eyes were wide, and I could see he was breathing fast, and I realized that my own heart rate had risen as well. The woods seemed even darker than they had been moments ago, the shadows deepening and pressing in almost menacingly. We turned fully around at the same time and were confronted suddenly by a tall figure looming over us. Blar, blar, blar! It was Dad. We both screamed as Dad yelled and waved his arms in the air, and then he started to laugh at us. He chuckled to himself. You should have seen the looks on your faces. Dad! We exclaimed, breathing hard in fright. I thought I told you not to go any further than the clearing. He didn't sound too impressed. Come on, your mother's got lunch ready. Let's not tell her how far into the woods we've come, okay? Pete and I nodded in our agreement, and we followed Dad as he turned to head back down the path. As we walked back towards the clearing, I heard rustling behind us. It was like Pete had described, something big moving through the brush. Pete and Dad were laughing about Dad scaring us. I don't think they heard anything. I kept walking, looking back over my shoulder as I went, but couldn't see anything in the shadowy undergrowth. I quickened my pace to catch up. The rest of the day was fun. We headed back to the cabin, had a late lunch, and then spent the rest of the afternoon down by the lake. Later that night, Pete and I had been sent to bed, and as we lay in our sleeping bags, I heard something outside. "Pete, can you hear that?" I asked. I got a snore in response. He was already asleep. I slid down from the top bunk and rummaged around in my backpack, grabbing my flashlight from the bottom of it. I flicked the switch and nothing happened, so I shook it around and the light flickered on, casting a weak cone of light across the room. I opened the curtains and looked out of the window. The woods loomed out of the darkness, the beam of the torch just making across the clear area to the first trunks of the tree line. I shone the light back and forth, playing the light across the tree line, and something flashed in the darkness. It was only for a second, but in that instant, there were twin red spots pointing straight at me out of the darkness, like cat's eyes reflectors on the road. They would have been a couple of feet off of the ground level, and then as soon as they appeared, they were gone. I heard rustling, which faded rapidly away. Whatever it was had gone, heading away from the cabin and into the woods. I turned off the flashlight, slowly closed the curtains, and backed away, climbing back up and onto my bunk and into my sleeping bag. I stared at the ceiling in the dark, clutching the flashlight and listening hard, trying to hear anything outside over the noise of Pete snoring softly. "Just the raccoon looking for more food," I whispered to myself. It was a long time before I fell asleep. I woke up during the night. I lay in bed, trying to decide if I could go back to sleep or if I needed to pee, and decided on the latter. I slid down out of my bunk, being careful not to wake Pete, still slightly groggy from sleep. I stumbled down the hallway and into the bathroom, where I relieved myself. I was heading back down the hall to the bedroom when I heard something from the lounge further down the hall. I froze in place, listening hard. There was something in there. I crept ever so slowly down the hallway, passing the door to our bedroom, and peered through the doorway into the lounge. I relaxed when I realized what the noise must have been. The front door was open, creaking slowly back and forth in the cool night breeze. It must have not shut it properly, and it had opened in the wind. There were no lights on, but the lounge was half illuminated by moonlight coming through the windows and through the cracked open doorway. I stepped into the room, intent on heading to the door to shut it, and then once again froze a few steps in the room when I perceived I wasn't alone. Parts of the room were lit from outside, and this made it hard to see into the gloom of the other parts that the light didn't hit. But there was something in one corner of the room. I couldn't make out anything as I peered towards the shadows, but as the door creaked slightly more ajar once more in the wind, I saw the red light staring out at me from the dark. With a thrill of horror that sent the hair on my neck standing on end, I realized that they weren't lights at all. They were eyes. I took a step backwards, and as I did, the red-eyed creature in the shadows glared out at me. I could see a faint outline, a shape in the darkness, but nothing clear. Whatever it was a lot bigger than a raccoon. I opened my mouth to yell, but all that came out was a whimper. The breeze stopped and the door creaked once more, slowly closing this time. As the door closed, the beam of light that was coming through the gap slowly narrowed and then disappeared as the door came to rest against the jamb, just short of clicking completely shut. As the light disappeared, the red reflection in the creature's eyes faded from view, and I realized to my horror that I could no longer make out its shape in the darkness. I took another step backwards, and the thing growled at me from the shadows, a low, throaty rumble that filled me with dread. I heard the clack of nails or claws on the hardwood floor as it took a step towards me, and I finally found my voice screaming at the top of my lungs as I closed my eyes and covered my head with my arms, turning away from whatever the thing was and trying to cover up to protect myself. As I screamed my lungs out, I heard my parents yelling an alarm from the bedroom down the hall and scrambling sounds of them trying to get up quickly to come and see what was wrong. I heard the door open again in the wind, and I opened my eyes to see the end of whatever the thing was disappearing outside. It was big, at least dog size, but apart from a split-second glimpse of dark fur or hair, I couldn't see anything that would tell me for sure what it had been. My parents burst into the room, Dad running to grab me and Mom turning on the lights. They held me close, asking what was wrong. Dad was saying something about how I must have been sleepwalking and had a nightmare. Pete came in as well, and as the family gathered in the lounge, everything seemed much less scary in the light. Maybe it had just been my imagination. Despite my protests, my parents eventually decided I just had a nightmare, and everyone eventually went back to bed. Mom stood by my bunk and whispered soothing things to me as I dropped back into slumber. I awoke the next morning to sun streaming through the windows, immediately feeling much better in the daylight. The events of the previous night seemed far away, like they'd been a dream, and I wondered if that's all that it had been. Everyone else seemed to be already up and about. It was just me in the room. I got up and got dressed and headed out into the lounge where everyone was gathered having breakfast. "Good morning, honey," my mom called to me. "Did you sleep all right?" I replied that I was fine and set up about getting some breakfast. The rest of the day and the next couple of days as well were fairly uneventful. We swam in the lake while our parents read their books, and then Dad came in to throw us around in the water. We walked through the woods several times, taking different trails. Pete and I ran around like madmen out front of the cabin, playing tag and every other game we could come up with while Mom and Dad relaxed on the front porch. The nights, though, I had bad dreams about a dark shape scrabbling around outside. I'd wake up and listen hard in the gloom, trying to figure out if the noise was just the trees or something else. Saturday came, which would be our last night at the cabin. We'd be packing up and leaving in the morning. In the afternoon, Pete and I had gone back to the clearing in the woods, playing Star Wars this time. We were taking turns using the torch as a lightsaber. We must have played for hours, as I noticed the daylight was just beginning to turn to dusk and the woods growing dimmer as the light fled. For the life of me, I'd never been able to explain what came next. I wish that we had just walked out of those woods back to the cabin, but we didn't. You see, after that first night, I'd been afraid. Whatever the thing had been, it had shaken me badly. But I was one of those kids who had to know everything. And I had an idea about where I'd find out for sure. Deeper into the woods, where I'd heard something that first day. I stared across the clearing at the gnarled tree with the faded white blaze and decided that I was going to look before Mom and Dad came for us. Pete had piped up saying it was getting dark and we should start heading back. Dinner would be ready soon. I told him my plan and he shook his head vigorously. He didn't want to go deeper into the woods. Once again, using my big brother powers of persuasion, I convinced Pete that he'd get in trouble if he headed back alone, as our parents had told him that he had to stay with me at all times. I turned on the torch again. Pete hefted his sword stick and we set off together, heading past the gnarled, twisted tree that marked the path deeper into the woods. We walked in silence, carefully picking our way along the path in the dark, my crappy torch lighting the way for us. Every now and again it would flicker, so I'd give it a whack and the light would come back. I found myself wishing I packed spare batteries for the trip. We must have drained the power while we were playing with it. The evening was getting rapidly darker, the moon coming out and casting some dim light through the gaps in the trees. "Marty, I don't like this," Pete said apprehensively after about a minute on a path less traveled. "Neither do I, but we can't turn back now," I replied, looking back. I just can't understand why it meant so much to the 8-year-old me. By this point, I was starting to doubt the intelligence of the plan. I was too headstrong to admit and turn back. We continued along the path, my torch's light picking out the roots and branches that we needed to avoid. I felt apprehensive, and I'm sure Pete felt the same. This part of the woods had been bad enough in the daylight for the brief period we spent in it, but it was 100 times worse at dusk. I was jumping slightly at every shadow, every branch that reached out of the darkness at us. Eventually, the path turned sharply, and I lit up a gap between 2 trees that opened up into a second clearing. We stepped into it, and I noted with some relief that there didn't seem to be a path out the other side. I couldn't see a white trail blaze on any of them. I breathed a sigh of relief, deciding that we'd gone far enough and we could turn back now. I started to turn, and Pete grabbed my arm. "What?" I looked down at him. "Don't be scared, we're leaving now." There's something over there." He raised a shaky hand, pointing across the clearing. I looked across to where he was pointing, freezing in place when I realized he was right. There was something over there, lurking in the shadows. There was a little bit of light from the rising moon, but it wasn't a full moon yet, and the trees were a lot thicker here than in the other clearing, so it wasn't much help. The thing growled, sending the hair on my neck standing on end. As Pete and I both took an involuntary step backwards, I managed to lift my arm to shine the torch in the direction of the growl. Red eyes reflected the light brightly back at me. "Shit," I whispered to myself as the full nature of my stupidity hit me. In my effort to prove to myself that I was brave, I'd taken myself straight into harm's way. And what was worse was that I'd taken my little brother, who I was meant to protect, along for the ride. The thing stayed just out of the weak range of the torchlight, the dim cone of light just enough to make out its outline against the trees behind it as it padded back and forth, a low warning growl rumbling continuously in its throat. I could see it only a little better than I had been able to in the house, just as an outline, and the red reflection of the light in its eyes. It was powerfully built through the shoulders and forelegs, a small head on a large frame that tapered down towards its back legs. Maybe it had a tail? I couldn't tell in the dark. All I could really see was those damn eyes. It just seemed wrong somehow, twisted like the tree that marked the entrance to the part of the woods it seemed to live in. Pete was beginning to hyperventilate and my heart was hammering at 1,000,000 miles an hour. But I knew I needed to try and stay calm to try and get us out of this mess. "Pete?" I asked, not taking my eyes off of the red eyes being reflected in front of me. "What?" he stammered. "We're going to back away slowly, okay? Just stick with me. We'll be fine. It doesn't like the light." I was praying that I was right. The thing seemed reluctant to come into the torchlight. We backed slowly out of the clearing and back down the path that we'd come in on. We rounded the first corner and kept backing away. I kept the torch pointing in front of us as we slowly edged down the path, hoping that maybe the thing wouldn't follow us. My hopes were dashed when a shape appeared and the reflection bounced red off its eyes again. It was following us, stalking along the path after us, staying just out of the reach of my torch and making its way around the odd patch of moonlight that made it through the tree canopy above. And, of course, it was at that moment that the torch started to flicker and die again. "Shit, shit, shit, shit," I cursed, whacking the side of the torch to try and hit the light back into existence. But it continued to flicker, and then it died completely as the batteries finally gave up. "Marnie?" Pete sounded as terrified as I felt, suddenly enveloped in the dark. I heard the thing growl again, so I flung the torch in its direction and screamed at Pete to run as I turned to do the same. Whatever the thing was, it was now chasing us, and I could hear it getting a little closer with every step. Outstretched branches tore at our clothes, one whipping into my face and cutting my cheek. I barely felt the sting. The fear I was feeling at that moment was almost immeasurable. Pete was sprinting as fast as he could, but with my longer legs, I was beginning to outstrip him. "Come on," I urged, reaching for her and grabbing his hand to pull him alongside me. "You can do it. Just keep running." I spat the words out between frantic breaths. I realized that Pete was still carrying his sword stick, and without breaking stride, I stretched over and tore it from his grip, flinging it behind us as we ran. I heard a meaty thud as it landed, and then growls that sounded of pain and anger. It must have hit the thing. I just hoped that it would slow or distract it enough for us to get away. We kept sprinting down the track in the now near dark forest, which had been difficult enough when my torch was working. As we ran, I silently prayed that we wouldn't snag on a branch or trip on a root, as that would surely be the end of us. I silently wished I still had my torch. It would have made our fight easier. There! I saw the twisted tree, the outline just able to be made out against the dark sky thanks to the dim moonlight. By this point, we were both nearly out of our minds with fear. All that was keeping me going was the adrenaline, and I knew Pete would be much the same. We were both sobbing as we ran, taking in deep, ragged breaths as we ran. We burst into the clearing and were about halfway across it when Pete fell, tripping over a branch laying on the ground. He landed heavily, and my momentum from running carried me well past where he lay. I skidded to a halt, turning to head back to get him, and as the thing bounded out from the path behind us, I caught my first real glimpse of it, eyes widening in horror as it came into view. It was a twisted thing, like a huge dog or a wolf, but wrong somehow. Its proportions were all off. Forelegs were much longer and muscular than the hind. It didn't run like a canine either, moving more like a gorilla charging on all fours, its long dark fur shaking back and forth, and its lopped forward towards my brother. Long tongue spilling out from behind jagged white teeth and a snapping, slavering maw. And those horrible red eyes, glowing brightly with hunger in the dim moonlight. Pete was struggling to get up. He saw the thing come from the path and then turned his head to look at me, pleading, petrified, eyes locking with my own. I'll never forget that glance. In that second, I saw exhaustion, confusion, and an all-encompassing fear bordering on the brink of madness. But worst of all was the unbelieving, horrified betrayal that came into his eyes as I did the only thing that my terrified 8-year-old brain could think of. I turned away and fled. Pete's screams echoing after me as I went, rising in pitch and seeming to go on forever, then cutting off suddenly. I charged down the path, sobbing and shrieking as I fled in disbelief at what I'd done and sure that the thing would come for me next. Suddenly, 2 tall figures burst out of the dark in front of me and grabbed me. I thrashed about and screamed before realizing it was my parents. I could see Dad had the axe. They must have heard our screams. They frantically asked me where Pete was, but I was well past the point of being able to speak and just flailed my arms back down the path, pointing desperately back the way I'd come. Dad sprinted past us, raising the axe as he went, and Mom held me close before scooping me up into her arms and following him. As Mom and I rounded the corner into the clearing, I could see my dad kneeling in the center of it. I'll never forget the way that the moonlight glinted off the axe head as it lay on the ground next to him. I'll never forget my mother's screams as she saw what was left of her son. I'll never forget my father crying on his knees, great, deep sobs racking his heavy chest as he tried to shield us from seeing the worst of it. I'll never forget seeing past my father and spotting Pete's hand, skin stark white in the rising moonlight, but spattered with dark red gore. I think I passed out then. From what I was able to gather later on, Dad stayed with Pete while Mom took me in the car to the Johnson house to call the police and left me there as she returned with the state troopers and the ambulance. I'd gone into shock by that point. I never told my parents what really happened, that we'd gone past the first clearing and deeper into the woods. I'd spent weeks in a near catatonic state of fear and guilt by the time I was actually able to talk about what had happened. I told them that we'd lost track of time and were about to head back to the cabin when the thing had come from the path and gotten Pete before I could do anything. I already hated myself. I couldn't have dealt with them knowing it was all my fault. I told them that I didn't get a good look at it. My dad had seen a dark shape looming above the fallen figure of his son, but it had turned and ran as he came at it, and he hadn't seen more than a flash of indistinct fur and red eyes. The police decided it had been a wolf or a feral dog, but despite a search of the woods, they couldn't catch it. We never went back to the cabin, and neither did any of the rest of the extended family. Dad made a brief trip up at one point to clear it out, but as far as I know, it's sitting empty right now. Our family sold the land to the Johnsons a few years later, but I heard a while back that they'd sold up and moved away to retire, so I'm not sure who owns it at this point. Our lives went on, forever changed. None of us was ever really the same. One side effect is that I can't be in a dark room with a red electrical light in it, or I start having a panic attack. There's a lot of electrical tape covering lights on my appliances. The guilt gnaws at me constantly. It was my fault entirely, even if nobody else knows. It's been decades, but I still see Pete's face every time I look at myself, and I hear the anguished scream of my parents echo through my head when I try to sleep. And I'm terrified that someday it'll come for me too. That I'll be walking through my house at night, and it'll be there like I deserve it to be. That dark, twisted thing with the glowing red eyes. Oh, that was sad. What the fuck? My eyes are kind of teared up. Yeah, it was really good, but it was really sad. Hey, Audie. All right, here we go. Part 3 of Miss Marnie's Tea House coming up. Give my voice a little break here. Yeah. I mean, I can hardly blame an 8-year-old, you know? Like, he was 8. I mean, granted, who's to say that we would do the same thing at the age of 8? You know what I mean? Like, it's really hard to... Like, it's really hard to just kind of judge that, you know? Like, 8-year-old me, I don't know what 8-year-old me would have done, to be fair. At least I don't think I know what 8-year-old me would have done. 8-year-old me has gotten lost in the woods before. That was a time and a half, let me tell you. 8-year-old me got left in the woods by her cousins, and they thought it would be funny to leave me in the woods. And yeah, I think I was lost in the woods for about 2-3 hours. It was awful. It felt like 2-3 days. But yeah, that's some fucked up shit. No, not even gonna front. Not even gonna. Hey, you're into a tree. No. Yeah, my cousins were weird. Exactly. You can never... Fear does things to people. Exactly, Logan. Exactly. Oh, no. All right. Part 3 for Miss Marnie's Tea House. Give me time to get some water. That was a long story. I didn't think it was going to be that long. All right, here we go. Although I had successfully eliminated Alessandro Winters, my troubles weren't quite over. Namely, I had to figure out what exactly I was going to do about the grasshoppers. Now, if you'll recall, I had successfully disposed of the grasshoppers that I had unleashed when I brewed my black dragon pearls. You might think that's the end of that particular problem, but you'd be dead wrong. The fact that the grasshoppers emerged from my tea meant that all the tea in my little shop could be contaminated, and there would be no way of knowing until I tried to brew it. That nasty woman had left me with quite a dilemma. Of course, the only solution was to cleanse my entire tea house. The process is both painful and arduous, but it would be worth it. If I didn't manage to purify my tea, I'd have to throw it all out. or I'd end up victim to the grasshoppers. So, I returned home and picked out a basic Japanese green tea with long, twisted leaves. Going by the name of Gyokuro Imperial, it's famous for having a dark, vegetal taste. As far as teas go, it isn't one of my favorites, but I kept some on hand just in case of situations like this. Once I'd selected a portion of tea, I moved on to the garden I kept behind the house. I was instantly drawn to the hollyhocks at the edge of the garden. They were bright pink blooms on tall stalks, trumpeting proudly into the sky. I remembered when I was young that my grandmother used to make us hollyhock dolls. Childish games, however, aren't the only thing they're good for. It took me 20 minutes to select the most worthy blossom of them all. It was young and luscious, but not yet in full bloom. Returning to the house, I gathered my needle and thread and prepared to make hollyhock blooming tea. In Japan, it takes a woman about 5 minutes to sew together a bulb for blooming tea. I am not, however, from Japan, and I am not particularly good with domestic work. Sewing is far from my strong suit. In fact, out of my entire family, I'm the worst at wielding a needle and thread. Even more so when it comes to this particular tea. In order for the tea to do what I need it to do, I have to do more than scent the tea with hollyhocks. I have to include an offering as well. One that is not so severe as Jamie made, but painful nonetheless. Taking a deep breath, I reached for the pliers that I keep near my workbench. This wouldn't be pleasant, but I was no coward, and I certainly wasn't pathetic enough to be afraid of a little pain. Opening my mouth wide, I fixed the pliers to one of my bicuspids. I had a nice strong one on the right side of my mouth. It took a few good yanks and twists, but I managed to get it out. Oh, there was a lot of blood, but I'd expected that. I stuffed a rag into my mouth and dropped the tooth into my palm. I examined it closely to make sure that I'd pulled up the entire root. If I'd broken the tooth, I'd have to repeat the process. But I'd managed to get it out whole, as usual. With a relieved sigh, I slipped the tooth inside the hollyhock bloom. I could already feel my mouth healing itself. That's the nice thing about having my abilities. We heal quickly, and our teeth grow back. Most of the time. It took me 20 painstaking minutes to sew the tea leaves around the hollyhock. I had to make sure to sew them tight, but not so tight as to prevent it from steeping. I also had to use special thread that would loosen in the water, and then I had to make sure that the blossom wouldn't be harmed. Arduous work, indeed. Once the bulb was finished, just one bulb about an inch in diameter, I wrapped it in a silk handkerchief and headed for my tea house. It was about 11 in the morning, and I wanted to get the shop cleansed as quickly as possible so I didn't have to be closed any longer than necessary. There are people out there who need me, after all. I heated the water to about 100 degrees Fahrenheit and then dropped the bulb, using a glass tea kettle so I could watch it brew. For good measure, I added just a pinch of rock sugar. If you know anything about them at all, you know they like sweets. Then, I sat back and watched the magic. As the water softened the leaves and the thread, the bulb began to pulse and writhe. Soon enough, it opened and exposed the hollyhock inside. The flowers seemed to tremble with the heat of the water, but soon enough it unfurled, blooming completely in a burst of deep pink. I peered inside. My tooth was gone. That's how I knew the offering had been accepted. Satisfied, I took the glass teapot out through the back door, where a swatch of emerald grass drew the gaze of the sun. Very slowly and oh, so carefully, I poured the tea out into the ground, choosing the thickest patches of grass to concentrate my efforts. Afterwards, I sat in a wicker lawn chair and waited. It took almost 2 hours for them to arrive, but when they did, they seemed to come all at once. It started with a little wiggling in the grass, barely perceptible if I hadn't been looking for it, but I was, and when I saw it, I inched forward trying to see if it was finally happening. Out of a tuft of grass, it popped. It looked vaguely human, though its skin was wrinkled and charcoal gray, and its hair was long and stringy, looking for all the world like wet tea leaves. It had huge, ragged wings that were larger than its body. If they hadn't been so thin, the poor little thing wouldn't have been able to hold itself up. It had stark white eyes that seemed to glow in its skull, and it stared up at me, its mouth forming a mischievous little sneer. It always amuses me when illustrations in children's books depict fairies as dainty little men and women with pretty gossamer wings and flower dresses. If that's what you're looking for, you'll never find it. Fairies are not pretty creatures, but they are tough and hardworking, and they're usually willing to help if you offer them something in return. A few minutes after the first appeared, about 200 fairies were crawling out of the grass, standing by their brethren and waiting for my request. As an answer, I opened the door to my tea house, and they filed in. As the last one flew through the doorway, it looked at me pointedly until I shut the door. Fairies do not like to be disturbed while they're working. A few hours later, my tea house was clean, and the fairies were exhausted. As they trudged back to the grass from which they emerged, I was sure to leave out a few bowls of sugar water to express my gratitude. I shut the back door and opened the shop, sparing no second thought for my little fairy helpers. Unfortunately, I forgot that the fairies weren't the only creatures inhabiting the tea shop's backyard, and fairies are very mischievous folk. When I woke up the next morning and saw the news, I refused to believe what had happened. Of course, the newscasters had no idea how the woman had died. They said the victim was a 24-year-old Caucasian female with blonde hair and green eyes. It had taken some doing to find out her identity because she was withered down to the bone, her skin shrunk tight around her frame as though all the meat inside her had been sucked out. The police chief commented that he'd never seen a case like this before. But I had. Or, rather, I'd heard tell of it from my mother. And I knew immediately that this death heralded the return of someone I thought was long dead. The general consensus I've found is that dead people remain dead and there is no bringing them back. Sure, as a society, we're obsessed with the idea. We talk about necromancy and ghosts and psychics. We want to believe that death isn't the end. It's sweet, really, although sometimes a little pathetic. The thing is, death is real. It is the end. But that doesn't mean it is permanent. There are always new beginnings. My older sister was named Lysandra, but we called her Lisa. She was really only 2 years older than I was, but she had always seemed the wisest, more mature of us both. She didn't quite take to tea magic the way that I did. Instead, she followed in her father's footsteps. Her specialty was sewing. The garments she made were equal parts beautiful and powerful, able to create and destroy. Unfortunately, it was also excruciatingly painful. Each and every time she drew the needle through the cloth, it was as though she was sewing into her own body. And it wasn't just a strange psychosomatic phenomenon. Her skin was marred with thousands of little pinpricks and jagged tears, a memory of sewing long since complete. By the time she was 12, she was little more than a mass of scar tissue. The simple solution, one would think, would be to give up on her sewing, to allow her powers to lay dormant. But for our kind, this is as good as a death sentence. If our power isn't used, it begins to wither. As the power withers, so does the body, until it resembles the dead woman on the news. My sister lived 15 agonizing years, each day more painful than the last. The more beautiful her work became, the more hideous her body, twisting and molding into something barely recognizable as human. My mother couldn't bear to watch. She loved us, you know. Some people might say differently because they don't understand that her choice was made out of love and compassion. Compassion for a little girl whose existence was so incredibly painful. My mother told me what she was going to do. In fact, she had me do it and watched from afar, instructing me. And what we did had nothing to do with magic, at least not the sort that you're thinking. All chemistry is a little magic, but this was common. So common it had been observed in human society for centuries. The poison she kept for such occasions was strong and fast-acting, but it was not painful. I saw the effects of it myself, as my sister took a few sips from the cup and her eyes drooped. She was asleep within seconds and dead a few minutes later. It was the only time I'd ever seen her completely at peace, her body for once blessedly pain-free. Perhaps it was foolish to imagine that she understood what we were going to do, that she took the poison knowing she'd die, somehow able to discern what we had planned, that she'd appreciate it even, that she would see it as an act of love. It's easy to imagine such things. Things become much more difficult when a band of mischievous fairies reanimate your dead sister and she can finally speak for herself. I could have sought her out, but I didn't have the guts. In many things, I'm fearless. When it comes to the intimacy of my own family, I'm a shameless coward. Besides, I felt like I owed it to her, to let her come to me on her own terms, make of my life what she would. As I waited for her appearance, I watched the body count increase. The news was calling it an epidemic, and people were beginning to suspect it was some kind of disease. The term biological warfare was even thrown around a time or two. Of course, there aren't many viruses that can ravage the body the way that Lisa could. It was just after they'd found the 5th victim, a little boy who had disappeared from the local park, that she came to see me. I could feel somewhere deep in my bones that she would be coming for me. That's why I stayed at the tea house later than usual. I knew she'd be there. I sat down to brew a rare yellow tea and waited, my eyes trained on the door with the precision of a great marksman. True to form, she arrived at the witching hour, 3 in the morning, as my candles were burning low and I was on my 4th pot of tea. She was beautiful, just as I remembered her. Ever and always 15. Her face was round with baby fat and her curly hair hung in dark blonde tresses down to her shoulders. Her body looked lithe and strong, no doubt thanks to her sacrifices. Truth be told, no one would have guessed we were sisters until they looked at our eyes. Our eyes are mirror images, big and hazel and unsettling. For many long moments, neither of us spoke. It was quite some time before I summoned the courage to pour her a cup of tea, and she deigned to sit with me as she sipped it. "Aren't you afraid?" I asked as she drank it without hesitation. To the untrained eye, she didn't look dead. She looked very much alive, in fact, but even the most oblivious of persons would be able to tell that she was different. I could feel it as she stared at me, her eyes unblinking.
"You betrayed me with a cup of tea once before. I know you aren't stupid enough to try it again."
The word betrayed hurt like a physical blow, but I reined in my emotions. We did it out of love. We couldn't bear to watch you suffer. It was the truth, and it was all I could offer her.
"It was my burden to bear, and the decision was mine to make, not yours."
I had no counter to that. We continued to sip our tea, drinking in the sight of each other. The empty years of separation stretched out between us like a yawning gulf. "Are you going to kill me too?" I asked. She shook her head. "Why did you kill them?"
"I was hungry."
"Hungry enough to kill 5 in 2 weeks?" At that, she smiled at me. It transformed her, and I knew that she was no longer human. She was Lisa, of course, but she wasn't the same Lisa that I'd once known. Death had done something to her.
"Death leaves a person hungry. Your little stunt did yield some good, little sister. In death, I learned many things, secret things, and I learned that blood and flesh and bone, these things keep the pain away. These things are my salvation."
The air suddenly felt rigid. She was looking at me the way I imagine a wolf looks at the sheep it's about to rip apart. "What do you want from me?" It was the dreaded question, one that, as yet, I'd been too afraid to ask. She had to want something, anything to reconcile my past wrongs. Whatever she asked for, it was my duty to give.
It's hard work finding food, seeking out the plump and juicy and delicious. It takes time and effort, both of which are better spent on my sewing."
She sipped her tea as I gave her a surprised look.
"Are you so surprised that I've returned to my craft?" It's my destiny, and now I found a way to do it without pain. And you're going to help me. You will find victims for me. Most anyone will do. I will require at least one a month, sometimes more. You'll bring them to me, and you'll let me do what I have to do.
And if I don't? I thought of what I'd done to Jamie. I thought of doing that to someone new every month for the rest of my life.
She shrugged as she said, "Then I'll take your life instead, as is my right, and I'll move on with my existence."
I paused to consider that, knowing it wasn't an option. And yet, what does it feel like? What you do to people? She seemed to have anticipated the question. Her eyes darkened as she reached her hand to me, palm up, and waited for me to take it. Before I made my choice, I had to know. So I ignored the alarm screaming in my brain and I took her hand. The pain that flashed through my body was pure agony. It was a litany of fire poured out into each and every one of my nerve endings. My throat and chest constricted and I couldn't breathe. It felt as though my bones were turning in on themselves, crushing my internal organs into mush. I could feel a hot pressure behind my eyes, and I wondered for a moment if they would pop right out of my head. My mouth opened to scream, but nothing came out. Instead, my lips withered back from my jaw, leaving my jagged teeth exposed as though I were already no more than a skull. She pulled back and I collapsed against my chair. It was several long minutes before I returned to normal, my body pressure evening out and my breathing coming in ragged gasps. She couldn't have touched me for more than 2 or 3 seconds, but it had felt like hours.
"Now you know what it was like for me all those years," she said.
There was no hate in her voice, no relief, no absolution. Nothing. She was no longer capable of true emotion. She simply existed, life in its purest, most basic form. She was terrifying. As I began to tremble, she waited for my decision. In the end, I had to make my choice. It's been 6 months since Lysandra was pulled out of her grave in the back of the tea house, and time has gone by slowly. 6 months translates to 6 victims, to both feed her hunger and placate her gnawing pain. At first, I tried to only choose people who deserved such a terrible death. To kill is not such a difficult feat, but to do so repeatedly over a long period of time, that takes a toll even on something like me. Eventually, I was forced to confront what I already knew to be true. It is impossible to tell who deserves to live and who deserves to die. Life is never so black and white, so morally clear. We'd like it to be, of course, but the fact of the matter is that good and bad are muddled together into humanity, and there's nothing we can do about it. Last month, an absent-minded mother left her 3-year-old daughter at the tea house while she ran out to do some errands. Lysandra wanted her. There was nothing I could do but oblige. Through all this pain and suffering, there was one shallow comfort that I'm eternally grateful for. At least I never hear them scream. That last part always gets me. You kind of forget that Marnie is kind of a villain at that moment. Like, she's been a villain in like the first 2 parts of Miss Marnie's Tea House. It's so screwed up. All right. Next story is called Hidden People. And this is by Curious Insect. Feel free to read with me as I read aloud. It had to be close to 12 now. The silver gleam of the full moon was spilling through the woodland trees, illuminating all it touched. Evan looked at his watch. It was 5 minutes to 12. Although it was not a necessity, Evan wanted to get there by midnight. For each month that he decided to do this, he planned very carefully. While the moon's reflected light was growing, he would gather the things they liked, always careful to not pick up any metals and plants with vibrations that could harm them. Such items could be to them like sulfuric acid could be to humans. Though if it was to be milk, butter, or his own body, he would make sure it was fresh. They preferred things to be fresh. Some months he would not come at all. He liked to remind them that he would not rush to appease them. He did not fear them. Though his father had said to him that this is what he must do now that he had moved away from the family home, they would see Evan as independent, so his father's efforts would not count for him. If Evan abandoned them, things would grow a lot worse for him. He kept walking through the woodland, not thinking so much as simply just walking and knowing that the correct path was underfoot. Evan had learned that he functioned best when he allowed his senses to take lead. Thoughts could be very distracting. His current goal was to get to the burrow in the tree, and that was simply what he would do. As he got closer to the burrow, he began to feel more awake, a sign that he was close to it. He heard a sound in the trees, a rustling. He continued walking without turning to pay it any attention. He had never allowed himself to fear them. Evan felt that he was above that. After all, he saw his surroundings through more than one pair of eyes. In fact, the only reason he could see them was because of this sight. Evan focused on his own footsteps, his destination, and his goal. He was wearing his hiking boots with a steel toe cap. They were not too keen on the toe cap. Fortunately for them, Evan preferred to keep his feet to himself, so long as he wasn't provoked anyway. Walking at night with his hood up, standing at 6'4", Evan wouldn't be a silhouette anyone would be glad to see. Though the only people in these woods at such a time were usually the daring, unhinged, or unusual. The atmosphere seemed to be growing brighter, the moon, the light source, becoming more intense. Though also he could see different colors in the air, brighter colors. He was now in front of the burrow under the blackthorn tree. Evan had formed quite the bond with the tree within the years he'd lived here. The tree was ancient and very enchanting to look at. It was a little distance from the other trees and always seemed to be in a world of its own. But in the ground in front of it, leading underneath it, was a burrow. Generally, it wasn't very deep, and anyone taking a mere hike wouldn't think twice about it. But they hadn't experienced the burrow at a time like this. Considering it now, Evan could see great change. The hole was deep and dark, although there were orbs of light circling the tree and light cast by the moon. The hole remained entirely black. It was like a black hole swallowing up anything directed at it and leading to a place nobody knew. Evan stood a foot from the burrow and slowly knelt in front of it. Arm resting upon his bent knee, he watched the burrow and waited for a moment for them to feel his presence and grow familiar with it once again. With a calm disposition, Evan looked directly into the blackness. He then pulled his backpack down from his shoulders, unzipped it, and brought out the items. He carefully placed each of them in front of the hole. His father had said that to drop them down would be extremely unwise. They would not take too kindly to it, and would make that very known. Evan then arose and took a few steps back, kneeling back down again and watching the hole. The light circled around the items curiously, then abruptly moved back. 2 small, glowing, fiery lights formed in the black. Eyes. They stared back at Evan from the hole. Evan didn't know what it was exactly, though it was the one that most often greeted him there. It felt extremely ancient, even. Evan nodded once to the eyes, greeting them. They just stared back, staring into him. Evan knew the amount of layers those eyes could see through was inconceivable to man. It was okay for Evan to leave now. He took his backpack, turned around, and walked without looking back. Evan got home to the apartment and was silent. His flatmate, John, was asleep. He could hear him snoring in his room. Evan got undressed and slept into bed. He would sleep soundly tonight. A week later, Evan's eyes flew open, suddenly awake. They were immediately greeted with darkness, though the moonlight behind his drawn curtains allowed him to make out the silhouettes of the things in the room. His bedside table, his lamp, his mirror, and maybe something else, though he wasn't concerned for any of that. All he cared about was the hill in the woods. Evan immediately pulled his duvet open and swung his legs round to the floor. He had nothing in his mind but that woodland on the hill. He needed to get there. Without a memory of any dream or any reason for him to do so, he was only in his underwear, so he got up and went over to his wardrobe, taking out his black hoodie and jeans. He was completely focused on each passing moment as he dressed himself. He then left the room, not at all paying any attention to the dark mass in the upper corner of the wall. Evan made his way to the front door, not bothering at all to turn on any lights. He did not need his sight in any way. For this situation, they were quite useless guides. He then put on his hiking boots and jacket, took his car keys from the kitchen counter, and made his way out to the car. As soon as he was out of the door and in his car, he was on his way. Once he was coming up to his destination, he began to feel more relaxed, though his actions were still without usual logic, but that was mostly what he would expect, what with the strangeness surrounding each day. Every day of his life, even in his childhood, had been distant to normal reality. No day had gone by where he had not seen something the human eye was not supposed to see. Evan didn't know why, but he didn't have average human perception. That was something he was used to. And still, after being so different from those around him, he managed to get on well with everyone. All through education and at work, he had been popular, admired, even an object of lust. He didn't feel lonely or unstable, no matter how distant his world was from everyone else's. Maybe that was because his family accepted him. Maybe it was because he had always received adequate attention from those around him. A day at school, socializing and studying, to a night of being watched by black masses of smoke standing at 6 feet tall. He could adjust and accept greatly. Maybe it was just because it was his life. To him it was normal, so there had never been anything to get used to. He parked on the road beside the bottom of the hill, switched off the engine, and stepped out of his car. He looked up towards the hill on which his part of the woodland resided. The moon was watching over the trees, though she was pale from the blanket of clouds before her. Evan could see patterns of energy emitting from each tree, though radiating from the mist amidst the trees was darkness, and that was where Evan had to focus. Evan began to climb the hill, treading straight through the vegetation. He could feel something watching him from the darkness. It was calling to him, beckoning him up the hill with its energies. It had reached from his own bed. Each step felt natural, as though he was being led, though he felt so out of touch with the physicality and solidity of his surroundings. He had experienced things like this before, though this felt much more intense. Once he was up in the woodlands amidst the trees, he could see early in his head where he had to go. A clearing. He had been there before. It was sloped, populated by blackthorn trees, though in the center was an oak tree of great age. The trunk was very wide and rough, and thick moss-coated branches came out of it from the top, growing in every direction. The clearing was quite high up on the hill, so he would have to trudge through ivy to get there. The image was still in his head, but it didn't feel like a thought or memory. It felt like he was seeing it as it was. Evan made his way through the clear path. He passed a few young foxes, gaunt and wary. They were about to run off, but the peculiarity emitting from the young man caused them to hesitate, eyeing him with curiosity. Without taking their eyes off him, they slowly retreated into the darkness. The moss fluttered straight past him, preferring the spaces far from him. Evan continued to walk. With each step he took, the image in his head grew clearer. The sound of the ivy brushing his boots, the rough soil underfoot, every sensation seemed heightened, though still somewhat distant. He knew immediately once he'd reached the clearing. The moonlight had grown dimmer, blocked off somewhat by the shrouding branches of the oak tree. It was looming down over Evan, watching him. Though darkness was still in the background, its blackness fixated upon him. Evan stood in the center, waiting. For what, he didn't know. He just knew he had to do so. He was calm, disturbingly calm. There was a silhouette to his left side, average height, man-shaped. Calm. To his right side, there were lights. Jack-o'-lantern, will-o'-the-wisp. He recalled the writing in his father's folklore books. He turned to them, his attention captured. They were bright but gentle. There were 3 of them, about the sizes of tennis balls. 2 of them were pale red, like dim but pigmented fires. The other was white. Seemingly satisfied that they captured his attention, they began to move, weaving in and out of each other, dancing around in indescribable patterns. Evan was beginning to get lost in them when they abruptly blended into each other and became one. Evan's eyes began to burn and he began to feel lightheaded. He looked away. The lights vanished. It was then that he noticed the shadow that initially had been one at a distance and now had become several. It was moving towards him, seemingly from all sides. Drowsy. They were mirroring each other. At first it had seemed like they were sliding human shapes, but as they approached nearer, it became more apparent that they were masses more than anything. Shadows, blackness. No matter where he turned, he could still see them. He closed his eyes and they were still there. The light-headed feeling intensified. Evan pressed his hand to his forehead as if that would somehow still his increasingly spinning head. He could feel them around him, wispy, though intense, touching him in ways that no solid thing could. Finally, he felt himself being torn from his body, shooting up into Nyx and being thrown into the blinding brightness of ether. Evan's eyes opened and he found himself in a corridor. He sat up slowly, becoming aware of the pounding in his head and his sudden blurred vision. He slowed, looking around him, observing the environment he was in. His vision had grown slightly clearer, but not by much. He could make out more of his surroundings. The corridor was very long and empty. The walls were white and the floors were gray. The floors seemed to shine and looked like they should have felt cold, yet the sensations of temperature seemed to be non-existent. There were rows of doors on each corridor wall, and there also seemed to be moving shapes between the spaces. His eyes kept attempting to focus on the things around him, but they were failing miserably. Though this place, it still seemed familiar. He'd never seen it before, but he felt like he had been here before. He began to rub his eyes. It was then that he felt it. Something was in front of him, staring straight at him. Evan got to his feet and allowed his eyes to adjust. Directly in front of him stood a human-like shape. Like Evan himself, it was tall. It was made up of patches of dull and grim colors, the occasional vibrant one. It stretched out its arms, long and thin they were, and its long fingers pressed into Evan's eyes. Evan was taken aback, flinching. He felt a strange liquid on the thing's fingers, greasy and unpleasant. In an involuntary response, Evan tightly closed his eyes. Upon reopening, everything was perfectly clear. The first thing he noticed was that it appeared like a man in his early 20s, like Evan was, or a bit younger. His nose was long and thin, his lips were also thin and deep crimson. The color stood out in contrast with the milky whiteness of his clear, taut skin. The man's hair looked soft and shiny, shoulder length and raven black, but the features that stood out most on his face were the eyes, large and maroon with black vertical slits in the centers. Evan observed the man's attire. He was dressed in a way that reminded him of an Edwardian or a Victorian style of dress. He wore a tailcoat over a white shirt, a black bow tie, braces attached to his trousers, and a bowler hat and shiny shoes. His entire outfit looked new and crisp, the fabrics perfectly smooth. He, or rather it, appeared in a way that was a third-dimensional being could understand, and that was simply what it was. Evan remembered his father warning him that they did this and going on to say that behind the deception was something not even Evan could picture or perceive in any way, shape, or form. The man was not recognizable, though he was also not unfamiliar to Evan, much like the rest of the environment. "What is it this time? I've been leaving you things just like my father said to," Evan said. "Your father doesn't have all the answers." Its voice was low in pitch and had a somewhat unnerving, unrecognizable accent. Evan chuckled sarcastically, not taking his eyes off it. "So, have you made a personal name for yourself then?" Nariek. Backwards words. Evan noticed it immediately. He was no stranger to the games they liked to play. "How interesting. Well then, I'm called Knave." "Knave," he repeated. "I may use that sometime." Something about the blankness in the man's response unsettled Evan. There was an uneasiness about the man, the way his mouth remained straight, lips unmoving when he spoke. The way he did not blink, not once. Those eyes, a deep, intense color, the shade of dark, fresh blood. The slits were focused on Evan, thinning, then dilating slightly. Why did they do that? For a moment, their perception just stayed there in union. Or rather, the creature stared at Evan, observing him. The eyes were doing more than just watching, they were digging. Evan knew they were seeing far more than they appeared to. Those eyes could see through anything, including illusion. "They trick you," Evan's father had told his son. "It's called glamour." Though his father had also said could never be perfect. They would never be just like humans, no matter how accurately they attempted to mirror them. His father had been right so far. Evan was seeing it right then. It may have looked like a man, but there was nothing human about those eyes. Evan cut his thoughts short, not wanting the man to know them anymore. The eyes just continued to stare back at him. "There's something here for you to see." The man began to walk, not too slow nor too fast. As they passed each door, Evan got cryptic hints of what they may have lurked on the other side. Each door emitted its own sound, and each chill he felt brought with it its own very individual and unique sense of dread. It was all too bewildering. Nearing the end of the corridor, Evan could see golden light emitting from the right corner. Evan subconsciously began to slow his pace, distancing himself from the man, wary of what was around there. As soon as he became aware of what he was doing, he picked up his pace again. They turned the corner. Evan could not believe what he was seeing. They entered a vast room. Inside of it was a sight Evan had never seen before. It was beautiful and enchanting. The walls were covered with art, naked bipedal male and female bodies with skins in many shades of browns and reds, sparkling lakes in jade and sapphire shades, flowers with petals and colors Evan had never seen before in his entire life. Nothing like any color of the known color spectrum. Right ahead of him was an altar. The wood looked like mahogany, but Evan knew it wasn't truly that. And around the room stood gold, brass, and silver statues of the gods and mythological creatures of many human cultures. There were also unusual stones and crystals upon the altar. Some of them looked like known stones, though they were not quite the same. Everything seemed to create one big picture. It seemed to portray existence in some sort of complex way. Or maybe they were just mocking humanity in their ways. Far too filled with awe, Evan had initially not been able to say anything. The environment had been too loud, louder than even his own thoughts. Curiosity brought him a voice. "What is this place?" The man turned to face him. He looked pleased. "Perception." "Whose?" The man smiled softly, but it looked wrong with his features. Evan noticed the atmosphere changing around him, the room seemingly melting, the pigment of color fading out. Evan turned, watching it all disappear before him, marveling at it. Everything once seemingly solid became liquid, then blurred out to gas and became simply a room, just as plain as the corridor had been. Evan turned to the man for some sort of familiarity and stability, though he discovered its appearance had changed along with everything else. It looked like the male appearance, but now female. Raven black hair, though now flowing and long, porcelain white skin, deep crimson lips. Though her eyes, they seemed more human. Still not perfect, however. And the face, well, it was a face he'd seen many times before. He'd been seeing it in his dreams and nightmares since he was a child. The clothes were gone. The woman stood naked in front of him, small breasts thin at the waist. Evan could feel his mindset begin to alter. His instinct taking over. Sense was slipping away. Not much seemed to matter anymore. It was clear the creation of illusion, glamour, and even though it was becoming apparent to him that the whole purpose of this visit had most likely been their idea of a fun game, Evan felt his resolve moving increasingly further away from him. The woman took a sudden step closer to him. There was an impish quality in her expression as she pressed her unclothed form against him. He suddenly felt it then, like he was a part of her somehow. It was as though she wanted him to feel like she wasn't as foreign as she seemed. He rested his hands upon the body, allowing them to slip down the small of her back and wander around the curvatures of her exposed hips. It felt soft, like skin. He pressed his nose into her hair. Her scent was light and feminine. Instinctively, he pulled her body tighter against his. His flesh was satisfied at its womanhood, but his mind was not. Evan's perspective began to change, and he loosened his grip on her. He felt her energies turn dreadful. As her body lost contact with his, he saw her face again. It was blank, featureless, just white skin. He felt a pang of fear and pushed her away, startled. This enraged her, turning her skin gray, scales forming upon it. Her eyes formed once again, though into burning red fires. It was then that a hole stretched open where a mouth should have been, and a shrill, piercing sound escaped from it. It was ghastly, unlike anything Evan had heard before. An inhuman sound provoking dread, fear, and terror in their deepest forms. The wailing formed words, "You're not theirs, you're ours!" Evan froze and became dizzy. His head began to spin rapidly, faster and faster. Felt as if the sound was seeping into his pores and filling his entire being. He felt himself being lifted and suddenly spinning with it. Brightness closed in around him, encasing him and blinding him. He was losing touch of this place, this world. He was being thrown around the spaces between the dimensions of the cosmos, and then he felt nothing. Evan awoke to the sound of morning birdsong and trees whispering to each other in the wind. He felt the cool breeze of the morning air on his face. He opened his eyes and found himself lying under the oak tree in the clearing. The forest was still and the air was tranquil, though he felt a bit rough. He had no idea what time it was, but judging by the dim daylight glow, it had to be somewhere around 7 a.m. Evan's eyes felt itchy and sensitive. He rubbed them as he slowly arose from his spot. It was then, standing up, that he became aware of his pounding head. He groaned, holding a hand up to it. He didn't want to have to go to work today. He then remembered it was his day off and felt a sudden gratitude. He began to walk down from the clearing, through the ivy and onto the pathway. Even though he was experiencing pain and discomfort and wanted to get home quickly, he forced himself to take a slow stroll to his car. To fail to do so would result in a stronger headache. Once he made it down to the car, he climbed into the vehicle and drove home. It was 7:08 a.m., and John was sitting on the three-seater chair with a glass of water. When he woken up this morning, it had become apparent that he was alone in the apartment. This was no concern to him. He thought that Evan must have risen earlier than usual and taken a walk. It wouldn't have surprised him. The guy was rather spontaneous. He hadn't heard Evan getting ready and leaving the house, but John was a heavy sleeper. It was very unusual for him to be awake so early on a weekend. It was possibly because he had such an early night. He'd gone to bed around 8. Something about yesterday had drained him. He didn't know what. All he knew was that he just wanted to sleep. Now he was awake. He brushed his teeth, but not bothered with anything else. He just wanted to sit for a while. He heard the front door open and turned to see Evan coming through the door. He looked rough. Bloodshot eyes, his usually neatly styled dark hair was a mess, and his clothes were dirty. "What the hell happened to you?" John asked. "I have the biggest headache," Evan replied, ignoring the question. "Where have you been?" "The woods." Evan allowed himself to drop down beside his friend. John got up, took an ice pack out of the freezer, and threw it at Evan. Evan just lay there with his eyes closed. John sighed, picked up the ice pack, and applied it to Evan's forehead. Evan let out a sigh of relief. "What's wrong with your eyes?" "They're too bright." "What's too bright?" "Who are you, my mother?" John sighed. "Well, what am I supposed to do? Stay silent? You just come back here looking like you've been dragged around the woods all night. You're making no sense." Evan didn't respond. He just stared up at the ceiling blankly. After a while, he said, "They want me more than ever now. I think I'm going to find out." "Find out what?" "Why?" John didn't say anything more about it. Evan coming back in such a condition began to make a bit more sense after that. Evan didn't need to say any more. John just knew it was something that would only make sense to him. He thought Evan was weird, but he didn't think he was crazy. John thought back to all those times as children when he'd stayed over at Evan's house. Sometimes when they were sleeping, something would wake John during the night, an unsettling feeling and energy. He could feel it coming from Evan. He would look over and he would be able to make out in the dark an even darker spot. A great pitch black shadow looming over his friend, watching him sleep. On the rare occasion, he would see Evan lying there talking to it in whispers, though sometimes he'd be still just staring at it. John remembered growing fearful. Evan had looked dead. He had been so still and his eyes had been so empty. It was as if the shadow had been death pulling the life out of him. Sometimes John could have sworn it had eyes, glowing orange eyes. John would just close his eyes, pretending to be asleep, swearing he wouldn't open them until morning. Sometimes he had hated it when Evan stayed over. Not because of Evan, but because of the nights. He had hated sleeping in the same room as him. The day and evenings would be great. Evan's mother would whip cartoons on for them, and they'd watch them all evening. Evan would sometimes even teach him how to draw. Drawing was something Evan still loved to do to this day. They listened to music, not care about girls, college, or money, or anything like that. They were kids and life was simple. But some of those nights caused John feelings of dread. Back then, the idea of ever living in a cabin with Evan would have terrified him. But they were grown now and slept in separate rooms. The weirdest thing to happen these days were usually only caused by Evan. John wasn't a child anymore, he was a man. He would never allow anything to scare him like that again. He didn't want those damn things in his home. He wouldn't have any of it. "What are you doing today?" Evan asked him. John was slightly taken aback at Evan's sudden calmness and changed the subject. "Nothing." "Let's just chill then." "Here?" "No, outside." It was 12, noon. The woods were quiet and still. Evan and John had been walking for a while, not much conversation had gone between the two. Once they were at the woodland hill, John began to feel a slight difference in his friend. They had been in the woods together before, though this time it was different. There was a distance in Evan, as if his mind was not entirely with them. Evan hadn't said much about what they were doing, just that they were chilling out. John had showered and dressed without questioning him. Why would he need to be concerned? The fact was that for the past few weeks, Evan had been acting particularly unusual. Unnerving, even. So this walk in the woods was causing John to feel ever so slightly on edge, especially considering how strange the air was around Evan recently. Nevertheless, John hoped that this walk would be the thing to get some normality back. Evan led them to the stream, where beside it he lay down looking up through the trees. John stood there staring down at Evan. Evan gestured for him to sit. John set himself against a rock, watching Evan. "What?" Evan asked. "Nothing." "What is with you these days? What's with you?" It was more of an accusation than a question. Evan turned to John and glared at him. When he realized that John was just going to stare straight back, Evan shook his head and turned away. He continued to gaze to the tallest branches. There was no brightness or blue, just white and gray. He looked up at the whitest cloud. It looked fluffy and soft, though really it was just countless water and ice droplets formed together. Evan thought about how fascinating it was, really. Looking at clouds, for Evan, was an eye-opener. It reminded him that everything was formed to create a solid image in the mind. Nothing was truly as it seemed. Existence was merely a vast picture of illusion nobody would ever understand. Not even himself. What if there was no truth? What if things were completely different through each pair of eyes to exist? Evan was beginning to believe, or realize more and more, that truth was simply what each mind and a pair of eyes made it to be. Because what the truth was to one living thing was never the same for another. John, do you remember when we were younger and used to see people in the clouds? For a moment, John thought Evan was referring to something unsettling, but then he remembered. Those summer days, lying on the dirt and looking up at the clouds, they would each try to outdo each other in finding a cloud with the most interesting shape. Though they would almost always end up being silly and finding a person they knew in it, or someone of the sort. John smiled at the memory. Yeah. Well, what if they were really people's faces? Yeah, John replied sarcastically, chuckling, because Uncle Paul is really going to be in the clouds. No, shut up. I mean, what if there are things that can appear to us in ways like that? Things? Things. Sort of like other conscious things. John thought about the orange-eyed mass of darkness standing over 9-year-old Evan's death-like body. He inhaled slowly and sharply. Well, he said, maybe there is. Evan turned to look at him. Does it disturb you? John could see Evan searching for any sort of fear or reaction in his eyes. He wished he wouldn't do that. I don't know, he lied. There was silence for a moment. John had wanted to leave it there. Then he got curious himself. What about you? Evan continued to look up through the branches. He looked calm. No hint of fear or uneasiness in his face. He was thinking about his answer. It should do, really, shouldn't it? But Dad told me there was no reason to be afraid, especially not for me. What would he mean by that? Why shouldn't you be afraid? Evan let out a dry chuckle. Well, really, I have no idea. Evan brought himself up to a sitting position, decidedly having enough of the clouds. He took a pack and a lighter out of his pocket and pulled out a cigarette. He inhaled as he lit up. My dad's weird, though, isn't he? He studies that sort of thing, he said on the exhale. Why? Not too sure. It's a hobby, I guess. He gets a good amount of money, though, on the books he writes about all that weird shit. Yeah, I think so, too. He's been doing it since way before I was born. They took the moment of silence to occupy themselves once again with their thoughts. The stream by them existed in greens and blues. It was somewhat still where Evan and John were, as if waiting for more of the conversation. After that, Evan was pulled from his distance by the sudden urge to urinate. He didn't notice it before, but it must have been there. Evan couldn't even recall drinking anything in the past few hours. He told John where he was going before leaving the stream to release. Evan found a spot behind a tree, unzipping his trousers, and did what he had to do. It was then, when he had finished up, that he became aware of a change in the atmosphere. He felt a feeling like a brief shock of electricity run down his back. It was a familiar feeling, an indication of a foreign world. A world consisting of things no solid human being could ever understand. Their world, where time and solidity was nothing. The mirror that reflected a completely different picture of reality. Evan had often wondered what would happen to a person if they were ever to experience this dimension in its truest form, void of any illusion. His father was convinced it would end in death. Evan thought he was right. After all, how could a person truly experience something that was foreign? Something that had never even existed to their own senses, their own eyes? A place where every sensation would be completely different, non-existent to their own reality. An experience like that, it would be worse than horror. It would be unimaginable, indescribable. Not one word or human experience would come close. Something like that, it could only kill a person. Evan turned around. It had been only 5 minutes when John heard the sound. It had come from the direction Evan had gone to. It had sounded most peculiar, unlike anything he had ever heard. It had sounded so abnormal that it made a great chill run through his body, made it feel a way that it had never felt before. The best comparison John could think of was being in a vehicle going over a great bump while a stick of ice went through his body. Not something likely to happen. He'd felt the sound more than heard it. It had been slow and rhythmic, inhuman, ungodly. And then it had stopped. John had been momentarily stunned, as if the sound had infiltrated his entire being and buried itself inside of him. Though now the panic and anxiety was beginning to set in, he quickly got to his feet. Evan. He began to call Evan's name. No response. He hurried off in the direction that Evan had went, the direction of that dreadful sound. He stopped immediately when he saw it, a gaping black hole swirling rapidly. He knew then that the sound had come from that. A devoutly religious person would have thought it to be the portal to hell. Looking at it, he began to feel dizzy. His head began to tingle and spin, his eyes grew heavy, his knees became weak, and he dropped to the ground. The first thing Evan smelled was mud. The first thing he saw when he opened his eyes was a figure in the darkness of night surrounded by candlelight. Evan was lying a small distance away from them, rather confused, anxious, and curious. He remembered what had happened. He had been in the woods with John. He had released his bladder, and then he felt something behind him. He turned to look, and his mind was completely blank. He couldn't remember anything he had seen after that, though now he was lying on the ground in a woodland, watching a young woman on her knees surrounded by a circle of candles and holding an old-looking book. She was wearing a black hooded robe, but her youth and femininity had been given away by her voice and slender hands. She seemed to be chanting something. Around her were orbs of dancing lights. She was calling them. Evan watched on in awe. The woman momentarily paused her chanting and abruptly whipped around. He suddenly felt a twinge of fear, as if he was a child caught doing something he shouldn't be. He couldn't see her face too well because of the hood, but for a moment he thought she was looking directly at him. To Evan's relief, she turned back around and continued her chanting. The words were being spewed under her breath, though Evan could only make out child and mother. It was then that he felt her desire, her burning desire to be a mother, a desire that could not be fulfilled. She was barren and was asking them for help. When she'd finished chanting, she got to her feet and undid the robe. The woman was wearing peasant clothing, a dark green bodice and skirt, right out of the Renaissance era. She turned around again, wary of what may be around her. Evan was relieved to realize that she had not been sensing him, but rather she feared being caught. Evan got a good look at her face. He could feel his father's blood in her. The woman then turned back around and pulled a knife out from a pouch. She then sliced her wrist swiftly and deeply and held her arm out to allow the blood to fall onto the soft earth below. It was her offering in return. Evan then saw many different scenes flashing into his head. Families that were generations ahead of the woman. Always tears and pain. Women with sickly children, barren maidens, babies deformed or lying in their mother's arms, dead. The women were not all his family's blood. Some of them had just married into the bloodline. Married into the curse. Though, after leaving things in the woods, their children had come out healthy and strong. The memories began to slow down, reaching normal speed on a familiar face. It was the devastated face of his mother as she wept over the frail and sickly body of a baby. Evan's father was holding her as she sobbed. All the while she just repeated that she had given them all that he had said for her to. They had finally cured her barren womb, but each child was still cursed. Evan saw his father's face. There was something in his eyes that said he had a plan. Evan suddenly found himself in the nighttime woods again, though these woods were very familiar. They were the woods he had grown up in, teeming with pure nature, life. Evan's father was kneeling in front of an oak tree. He kissed the sickly baby's small head and placed it down in front of the tree. He then walked away without looking back. Evan blinked and it was daylight. A baby lay there in the same spot, though it was very different. Upon its small chest lay a scrap of some sort of material. Happy, gurgling noises were coming from the baby's mouth. Curiosity got the better of him, and before he could stop himself, he found himself cautiously walking towards it. He walked until he was staring it right in the face. The baby looked like his mother and father, like the baby before. Though the first thing that came to Evan's mind was their art, their glamour. They were the masters of illusion. Things were never as they seemed. Its brown eyes looked up at him curiously, sparkling and healthy. Its mouth was stretched into a smile full of life. Evan knelt to look at the material. Etched into it was faded words. It read, "The other one." Evan then heard approaching footsteps on the vegetation. He stood up and turned to see his father walking towards the child. Evan swiftly moved out of the way. His father crouched down, looked at the note, and gently scooped up the baby into his arms. It beamed up at him. His father smiled back, and with the child, he walked away. "Brother." Evan turned around, and there it stood once again. It stood in his favorite form, the dark-haired female. Though Evan could see it in a new light now, it looked more familiar than ever. He no longer saw it as a foreign being, but more his family. After all, that's whom it was, his sibling, his twin. It held its hand out to him. He took it. Evan could not remember the first time they had made their presence known to him. He only remembered that, growing up, the monsters under the bed and in the wardrobe were real. He remembered the first time he had brought it up. His mother had been tucking him in, though there had been something else on his mind that night, and he knew that if it was not mentioned then and there, he would not have been able to sleep soundly. The question would have echoed in his head, spinning around and bouncing off the walls of his skull. She looked down at him with warm eyes the color of conkers, her long and silky jet black hair brushing his face, comforting him as she embraced him, ready to say good night, though he hadn't been. He asked her what they were. She told him his father would finish putting him to bed. She left the room. A few minutes later, Evan's father came in. He told him that there were many stories of them. Nobody knew what they truly looked like, though they looked unlike anything imaginable, unlike any visible thing on earth. They could only appear in ways that brains could perceive. In every culture since the beginning of time, there were only beliefs. Nobody truly knew where they came from, just that they were much older than humanity. Evan's father said that they were the hidden people, in a place close to his own, hidden by the cosmos from the direct perceptions of humans. And then he read to Evan. It was a folklore tale about guardians of the forest. That night, Evan had fallen into a deep and peaceful sleep. When John awoke, he found himself lying on the ground in the woods. It was still daylight, though the clouds had dissipated, making room for the sun. He looked around for Evan and saw him lying still on the ground. His eyes were open, but they looked empty and blank. John felt a horrible feeling in his gut. He approached the body. Evan? After a few excruciating seconds, Evan turned to face him and said, "Let's go back home now." John felt instant relief, so much so that he wanted to drop down and embrace his friend. Instead, he just said, "Okay." They made their way back, mostly silent. Once home, Evan would carry out his day as usual. Then, once night fell, in those small spaces of darkness between patches of light and the shadows, they'd still be there watching him like they always did. And just like any night, Evan would just go to bed and fall asleep. Well then, that was an interesting tale about changelings. That's wild. Oh, man. Aw, thank you. All right, guys, we're going to, all right. Good night, two geeky gamers. Get some sleep. We'll probably end on this next part, the final part of Miss Marnie's tea house. Mostly just because, give or take, I've been reading for about 3.5 hours now. I need my voice needs a rest. So, yeah, we'll end the night with Miss Marnie, the final part to Miss Marnie's tea house. So, let me just fetch that real quick. And we will get started with the finale. It's a short one. It's only 10 minutes, but I think that's a good place to stop. All right. See you later, Aquanor. Thanks for tuning in. All right, guys. This is the final part to Miss Marnie's tea house. Listen, Asuna. I scream all the time in bursts, okay? I don't scream for 3.5 hours straight. That's only in Final Fantasy when you're trolling me. All right. Here we go.
My sister and I lived in uneasy peace for a time. I fulfilled her demands, offering her any customer that caught her eye. In the meantime, she returned to her sewing, and soon enough we had expanded the tea house to include a few of her flashier items. In no time at all, she earned a name for herself as the town's best seamstress, and people came to see her as often as they came to see me. We ended up renovating the tea house so that she could have her own office. To be honest, it wasn't such a bad thing having her back. Business had always been good, but it was phenomenal when she started offering her services. Whenever her customers came in, they'd also get tea from me. I made sure to send all my customers her way as well. My sister, changed as she was, bore no ill will over her murder. It seemed as though she were no longer slave to such petty emotions as most of mankind. Actually, I was somewhat jealous of the change she'd undergone.
Most people look on sociopaths with fear, but sometimes I find myself thinking how nice it must be, lacking basic emotion. Unfortunately for me, I'm not a sociopath, despite what some of you may think. I do have emotions. I just happen to have the wrong ones at the wrong times, or so I'm told. At any rate, the only real problem with our arrangement was that she required so many sacrifices to keep her alive and happy. Eventually, people were bound to notice all the disappearances and put two and two together. As a result, it became painfully obvious that we needed to find another way to satiate my sister's hunger. The idea came to me slowly, but it was sparked by a rather unexpected event. I remember that it was Tuesday. My sister, you see, had an awful lot of appointments booked that day, and every customer who came in said, "Tuesday, Tuesday, Tuesday." She said she'd see me Tuesday. Unfortunately, she had to cancel all of them at the last minute because she was sick. It seems strange to me that you can still get sick after you've already been dead, but then again, I don't make the rules. So she was sick, and she was demanding yet another sacrifice. It would be the third one that month. We tried to keep it down to one a month, but this had been a particularly bad stretch for her, and it only got worse when she came down with what appeared to be the flu. My first mistake was trying to pick someone I thought would be particularly nutritious. Someone robust and full of life, full of strength. A middle-aged man who ran 5Ks in his spare time seemed like a logical choice. I didn't realize that consuming a sacrifice actually takes a significant amount of energy on Lisa's part. After I convinced the man to follow me to the back of the tea house, Thomas was his name, if I'm remembering correctly, she leaped on him and began her ritual. I watched for only a moment or two, long since desensitized and uninterested in her snacking habits. I was about to leave when something disastrous happened. Lisa let go. It was so draining, you see, sucking out his life force through her fingertips. She wasn't able to hold on until he died, and so she let go, and the life began to bleed back into him. It was a slow process, but as he regained more and more of his strength, it became harder to keep him pinned to the floor. "What do I do?" I screamed as she struggled to her hands and knees, panting with the effort.
Get rid of him. I'm full, she moaned. I can't take any more.
So, I did what she asked and I got rid of him. I'm not just a tea connoisseur, I'm also quite good with my hands. It took some doing, especially since he was getting stronger and stronger the more we struggled. But all the same, he ended up on the floor, eyes open, and neck broken. It was a strange sort of mishap. Neither of us had realized that she could consume a sustainable amount from one person without killing them. And that's when I realized she didn't have to kill her sacrifices. Sure, it usually took an entire human to satisfy her hunger for about a month, but given the right circumstances, she could partially drain one person over and over again. That way, I'd never have to find her new sacrifices, and she would have a stable food source. Of course, what person in their right mind would let her put them through such pain year after year after year? My idea was interesting, but totally impractical, given that tiny little problem. So I let it go, for the time being, and life continued on as usual. But normalcy has a habit of coming to an end in my life. Everything around me is made of chaos, and it's quite impossible to stay in the eye of the storm for very long. One of my longtime patrons was in the hospital. She was a kind old woman who often came to see me and drank a special tea designed to alleviate her arthritis. I quite liked her. She was strong and self-assured, and she made me a lot of homemade cookies. In absence of a biological grandmother, she did quite nicely. I decided to visit her with a special homemade brew. She had suffered quite a fall and broken her back. She'd come quite close to being permanently paralyzed. The thought filled me with dread. She was such a wonderful woman, so I used my most treasured and rare ingredients to construct a tea that would assist in the healing process. Her bones would mend in no time, and soon she'd be back in my tea house, chatting and laughing with me like she did every Thursday morning. Upon leaving her hospital room, I happened to pass through a long corridor that housed a great number of patients. And on my journey, a certain room with a certain patient happened to catch my eye, and I happened to stop and peek in. Quite a lot of happening for one measly coma patient. He couldn't have been more than 30, although probably closer to his mid-20s. He was a handsome man with dark hair and long eyelashes. I found myself imagining that he had green eyes. Something about his appearance struck me, and my mind wandered back to the idea I dwelt on for several weeks. A sacrifice who would never tell anyone what had happened to him. A sacrifice who would let her drain him whenever she wanted. It was entirely too perfect. So Lisa and I hatched a plan. A beautiful plan that was almost too good to be true. Even better, it required very little work on my part. I had managed to snatch the name of the patient, Arthur McVee. With just that information, we were able to find a few news stories describing what had happened to him. An unfortunate car accident had left him in a comatose state, and one of the articles we found expressed a fear that he may never wake up. That was enough to go on, and Lisa started spending each and every day at the hospital. She gained little information from the nurses about Arthur, but she managed to catch their attention. Eventually, she told them that he had been a very good friend to her when she was going through some very dark times. She wanted so much to meet with his family, but was afraid they wouldn't want to see her. Couldn't she just leave a message and perhaps they might contact her if they were willing? The nurses were moved and fell entirely into her trap. It was only about a week later when Lisa received the call. My sister happens to be very charming. She won over his family quickly and, upon finding out that he wasn't romantically attached, convinced them that she had been in love with him, hoping that he would one day look at her the way she looked at him. They grew to adore her, and she received unrestricted access to him. The hospital even made an exception to their family-only visiting hours, and she was able to see him whenever she wanted. I can sense your judgment even through this computer screen. The words I'm typing look so awful as they stare me back in the face, but what we did wasn't so bad. Not really. My sister can be a very kind woman. She treats Arthur's family very well. In fact, she sewed a wedding dress for his younger sister free of charge. It was a beautiful garment, and his sister had a lovely wedding day. Lisa and I were both in attendance. It's true, I grant you, that this course of action must cause Arthur considerable pain. Lisa has to feed on him at least twice a month to sustain herself. But it's really for the best, don't you think? Now all of our customers are safe. In fact, the vast majority of the townsfolk are safe. Yes, he suffers, but he suffers for the sake of his fellow man. Isn't there something beautiful about it? Perhaps it is unforgivable. Some people may choose to see it that way. As for me, I can't think of a better solution to a very complicated problem. I just hope that Arthur doesn't wake up anytime soon. Alrighty. That song is from, I forget the name of it specifically, the title, but it's from the soundtrack from Juniper's Knot, that visual novel I read on my channel a long time ago. It's on that soundtrack. It's really good though. Yeah, so we're gonna end the night there. Oh, I'm so freaking tired of my voice. I'm just gonna give it a little bit of a break here. But yeah, I'm glad everyone was able to come by. I'm glad you guys enjoyed the stream. I had a good time. I'm glad you enjoyed it, Jinx. I'm glad you had a good time. Yeah, it's definitely one of my favorite series on the channel that I've ever done. That and probably the Dad's Tape series was my other favorite one. I'm gonna be doing another series, one that I've been putting off for a while, but I'm finally gonna sit down and record it. But I do have more Higurashi coming. I finally got caught up with all of that. Basically I got caught up in the game or in the visual novel again where I left off before. So I'm gonna be picking that back up. I'll probably record it either tomorrow or Sunday when I'm on break. Probably like record maybe like 45 minutes to an hour, get that cleaned up and rendered and ready to go for you guys. But yeah, the next series I want to work on is called Claver House Emails. So definitely I'm excited about that. Totally stoked. But I'm glad you guys had a good time. Yeah. But thanks again for coming by and sitting around and listening to me read stories and play back stories for almost 4 hours. Jeez. But I hope everyone has a good night. Make sure you stay hydrated, stay safe, stay warm if it's cold, stay cool if it's hot. And yeah, until next time, bye.